In the summer of 1878, a British excavator working the ruins of ancient Kutha, a city in what is now central Iraq, pulled a broken clay tablet from a debris layer sitting directly above a burned floor. The tablet was small enough to fit inside a closed hand. It was cracked across the middle, and the edges had crumbled into dust before the excavator ever touched it. He wrapped it in cotton, packed it in a crate with 40 other tablets, and shipped it to the British Museum, where it was catalogued, given a number, and placed on a shelf in a storage room 3 floors below the main gallery. It would sit on that shelf, unread, for the next 41 years. When it was finally translated, in the winter of 1919, the man doing the work was an assistant curator who had been assigned the Kutha collection as a punishment for a professional dispute nobody now remembers the details of. He was expecting inventory lists, temple grain records, the kind of dry, repetitive, administrative writing that made up most of what came out of the ground in that period. What he found instead made him stop working for 3 days. He did not turn the tablet in immediately. He did not tell his supervisor. He copied the text by hand, took the copy home, and, according to a letter his widow later gave to the museum, he sat with it in his study for a full week before he brought it back and reported what it said. The tablet was not an inventory. It was not a temple record. It was, according to the translation, the curator eventually filed, and then, quietly, was never allowed to publish, a description of the process of dying, as understood by the priests of a specific Sumerian sanctuary that had been destroyed and then rebuilt at least 3 times between the 4th and the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. It described that process as a passage through 7 gates, each gate guarded by a different figure, each gate asking a single question. It listed all 7 questions in order. It described, in short, brutal phrases, what happened to the soul that answered wrong, and in the final broken lines, before the tablet cracked into unreadable fragments, it described what happened to the soul that answered right. The curator's report, dated April of 1920, is still in the museum's internal files. It is marked, in a hand that is not his, with a single word written across the top in red pencil. That word is hold, and beneath it, in the same red pencil, a second instruction: do not exhibit. The tablet itself was moved from the storage shelf, where it had sat for 4 decades, to a different room, one that required a supervisor's key to enter. And it has, so far as the public record goes, not been photographed or displayed since. There are 2 paragraphs about it in a 1923 museum bulletin. There is a footnote in a 1947 monograph on Kutha. Everything else that has been said about it has been said either in whispered conversations between specialists at conferences or in the private notes of the small number of scholars who were shown the copied translation on the condition that they never quote from it directly. Every one of those scholars is now dead. Every one of them left a note in the margins of their working copies saying the same thing in slightly different words. The note, in every case, says that the 7 questions are still being asked. This is a documentary about that tablet, about what it says, about the 7 gates it describes, the 7 questioners standing at each of them, the 7 questions they ask in a fixed and unchangeable order, and the 7 consequences that follow, immediately, from the answer that is given. It is a documentary about a text that was written down more than 4,000 years ago, by people who believed they were recording a process that had been happening since the first human died, and that would keep happening, without pause, without exception, and without appeal, for every human who has died since, and for every human who is going to die tomorrow. It is a documentary about what those people said the 7 questions actually are. You are about to hear all 7 of them, in order. Quick pause. This is new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document, the 7 resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the 7 gates, and the checklist of signs for the 8th. 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. Back to the video. The city where the tablet was found had a name in its own time. It was called Gudua, which the later Akkadian scribes rendered as Kutha, and which appears in the Bible in a single verse in the 2nd book of Kings as one of the 5 cities whose populations were transplanted to Samaria after the Assyrian conquests of the 8th century before the Common Era. That verse is the only reference to Kutha in the entire Hebrew scripture, and the people who compiled the book knew almost nothing about the city itself. What they did know, and what the verse preserves without any explanation, is that the transplanted population brought their god with them. The god's name was Nergal, and Nergal, in the older Sumerian record, was the husband of Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal was the queen of the underworld, and the underworld she ruled was the place, in Sumerian cosmology, that every dead person went to. Kutha was Nergal's city. The temple at its center was called Meslam, which meant the house of the warrior, and warrior was the polite way of saying the god who killed. Nergal was not a psychopomp. He did not guide the dead. He was the figure who received them at the far end of the process, after the passage was complete, after the questions had been asked and answered. And he was the one who assigned each soul to the position it would hold in the underworld for the remainder of what the Sumerians believed was an eternal, unchanging, and largely unpleasant afterlife. He was, in the theology that produced him, the sorting authority. And the temple that served him at Kutha was, according to the tablets that survive from it, the place where the priests were trained to understand what he was sorting for. To be trained as a priest of Nergal at Meslam was to spend 11 years learning a single body of material. That material was not, as it is often assumed, a body of ritual instructions. It was not a liturgy. It was, according to the description that survives in a training tablet from the reign of Naram-Sin, a description of the 7 gates, the 7 questioners, the 7 questions, and the categories of answer that each question was capable of receiving. The priests were trained to be able to describe, in exact and repeatable language, what happened at each gate, what was being tested, what the questioner was listening for in the reply, and what the consequences were for every possible category of response. They were trained, in short, to be able to tell a dying person what was about to happen to them. And they were trained to do this because the theology of Kutha held that a dying person who knew what was coming had a better chance of answering correctly than a dying person who did not. This is the first thing the tablet says. It is not framed as revelation. It is not framed as a vision. It is framed as instruction, which is to say, it is framed as something the priest is expected to be able to repeat to a family member of the dying, in the days or hours before death, so that the dying person can be prepared. And the preparation consists of memorizing the 7 questions in order and rehearsing the answers, so that when the moment comes and the first questioner appears, the answer is already in the mouth, ready to be given, without hesitation, without confusion, and without the fatal delay that the tablet describes as the most common failure mode. The tablet is called, in its own opening line, the Tablet of the 7 Passings. That is a literal translation. The word that is being translated as passings is a Sumerian word that also means, in other contexts, the crossings of a river, and the transitions of a musical mode, and the changing of a garment. It is a word that carries the sense of moving from one state into another, without necessarily specifying what the states are. The priests of Kutha understood, and the tablet makes explicit, that the 7 passings are the 7 transitions the soul undergoes on its way from the moment of biological death to the moment of assignment. Each transition is marked by a gate. Each gate is opened by an answer. And each answer, once given, cannot be revised. The 7 gates are not, in the Kutha theology, physical structures. They are moments, or, more precisely, they are the questions themselves, which is why the tablet, when it lists them, does not describe walls or doors or thresholds, and instead lists only the questioners and the questions. The gate is the question. To pass through the gate is to answer the question in a way that the questioner accepts. To fail to pass through is to give an answer the questioner does not accept, and the consequences of that, which vary from gate to gate, are the substance of what the priests were trained to explain to the families of the dying. There are 2 features of the tablet that scholars have found difficult to reconcile with what was previously believed about Sumerian death cosmology. The first is that the 7 gates are not the 7 gates of the descent of Inanna, the famous mythological text in which the goddess passes through a sequence of 7 doors, giving up a piece of her regalia at each, before arriving at the throne of her sister Ereshkigal. Those 7 doors are structurally different. They ask nothing. They demand only that the goddess remove 1 item at each threshold. The Kutha gates, by contrast, are interrogative. Something is being asked. And what is being asked is not, in any of the 7 cases, the surrender of an object. It is the delivery of a specific piece of information about the soul that is passing. The second feature is that the tablet does not describe the underworld as a single place, or the soul's fate as a single condition. It describes 7 possible outcomes, 1 for each gate, and it describes them as cumulative. To fail, the first gate is to be assigned 1 condition. To pass the first and fail the second is to be assigned a different condition. To pass all 7 is to be assigned the condition the tablet calls, in a phrase that has been translated into English in at least 4 different ways, the position of the one who was not stopped. The scholars who have looked at the tablet in the last 100 years do not agree on what that phrase means. They agree that it is the outcome the priests of Cutha considered the desirable one, and they agree that it is described in the tablet as extremely rare. Beyond that, the meaning of the phrase and the nature of the condition it names is one of the things the tablet was, in the museum's phrasing, held for. What follows now is a walk through the 7 gates, in the order the tablet lists them. The order is fixed. The tablet is emphatic that the order cannot be varied, cannot be skipped, and cannot be reversed. Every soul, at the moment of death, arrives at the first gate. Every soul that passes the first gate proceeds to the second, and so on, until either the soul fails and is assigned to a condition, or the soul passes all 7 and is assigned to the position of the one who was not stopped. There are no other outcomes. There are no exceptions. There is no appeal. The tablet says this 3 times, in 3 slightly different formulations, in the section that introduces the sequence, and it says it with the kind of emphasis that suggests the priests of Cutha were teaching this to people who had been raised in an older theology in which appeals were possible and who needed to be told clearly and repeatedly that the appeals had been closed. The first gate is what we will look at first. Its questioner has a name, which the tablet gives, and its question has a form, which the tablet also gives. What we will do, at this gate, and at every gate that follows, is to look at the name, the question, the category of answer the questioner is listening for, and the fate that follows each category of answer. We will do this 7 times. And when we have done it 7 times, we will look, in the final section, at what the tablet says about the 7th answer, and about the position of the one who was not stopped, and about why the priests of Cutha believed that anyone at all could reach it. Given how narrow, in their description, the path through the 7 gates actually is, before we begin, there is one detail about the tablet's provenance that most modern accounts leave out, and that is worth stating clearly. The layer in which the tablet was found, in the 1878 excavation, was not a temple floor. It was a domestic floor. The house that had stood on it was a small one, 3 rooms, built of mud brick, and it had burned. The tablet had been in the house at the time of the fire, and the fire had baked the clay hard, which is why the tablet survived, and which is also why the ink of the text, which was cut into wet clay before firing, was preserved so cleanly that the assistant curator in 1920 was able to read almost every sign without difficulty. The people who had lived in that house were not, so far as anyone has been able to determine, priests. They were, based on the other objects recovered from the same layer, a family of what the archaeological literature calls middle-status urban residents, which is a phrase that means they were neither rich nor poor and had probably worked in the temple economy without belonging to the priesthood themselves. The tablet, in other words, was not found in a place a tablet like that would have been officially kept. It was found in a place a tablet like that would have been unofficially kept. It was found in someone's home. This raises a question that the museum's initial catalog entry noted, dismissively, in a single line, and that the assistant curator in 1920 asked, seriously, in the report that got marked hold, the question is whether the tablet was a copy, whether the family in that small burned house had been given a copy, or had made a copy, of a text that was normally kept, and normally read, only by the priests at Mesopotamian, whether they had done this because someone in the household was dying, or was about to die, and whether they had wanted to be able to hear the 7 questions in advance, at home, in private, without the intercession of a priest whose services they either could not afford or had reason not to trust. The tablet, in that reading, was a leaked document. It was the theology of Mesopotamian, escaping into the general population, one household at a time. And the fact that it was found in a burned house, in a debris layer that is dated to a period of political instability in central Mesopotamia, is not, in the curator's phrasing, a coincidence. The house had burned during a riot. The tablet had burned with it. And what the fire had preserved was the evidence that the theology was moving out of the temples and into the streets. That is the political context of the object. The theology it preserves is older than the object. The priests of Cutha said, in a separate training tablet found on the Mesopotamian site in the 1920s and now in the Baghdad Museum, that the 7 gates had been described to the first priest of the sanctuary by Nergal himself, in a dream, in a form that the priest had been instructed to memorize word by word, and to teach only orally, to a single successor in each generation. That system had lasted, the training tablet says, for many generations. Then, at some point that the tablet does not date precisely, a decision was made to write it down. The decision was controversial. There is a fragment of a later tablet from the reign of Hammurabi that refers to the writing down of the 7 passings as the moment when the priesthood lost the last of its unshared knowledge. That fragment goes on to say that the writing down was necessary because the number of qualified successors had fallen too low to guarantee oral transmission, and that the priests who authorized it did so knowing they were ending something. What they were ending was the exclusivity of the 7 questions. What they were beginning was the possibility that the questions could be studied by anyone who could read. The house that burned at Cutha, in a period we cannot date more precisely than sometime in the middle of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, contained a copy of a text that had been written down under those conditions, by priests who were losing the ability to transmit it orally, and who had chosen, against the advice of a portion of their own institution, to preserve it in writing rather than let it disappear. Whether they were right to do this is a question that has been asked and re-asked in the fragments and commentaries that survive, and that was still being asked in some of the private notes of the 20th century scholars up until the present. The tablet exists. Its content is legible. And what it says is that the 7 questions are not the invention of the Cutha priesthood. They are, in the tablet's own claim, the questions Nergal himself asks. They are asked, in the tablet's own claim, of every soul that dies. And they are asked, in the tablet's own claim, in the same order, with the same wording, and with the same consequences. In every case, without variation, without exception, and without the possibility of appeal. We will begin, now, with the first of them. The first gate. Its questioner is named Nedu, which is a Sumerian word that means, in its ordinary usage, the one who counts. Nedu was, in the older mythological texts, a functionary of the underworld, the porter, the figure who kept the record of arrivals. In the Descent of Inanna, he is the first person the goddess encounters at the outer wall, and he is the one who goes back to Ereshkigal to report that a visitor has come. In the Cutha tablet, he is the questioner at the first gate, and his function has been sharpened from the general porter of the older texts into something more specific. He is the one who verifies. He is the one who confirms, before anything else is asked, that the soul in front of him is the soul it claims to be. The question Nedu asks is this: what name were you given at the hour of your first breath? The wording of the question is exact, and every part of it matters. The tablet spends a long section, in the material leading up to the first gate, on the reason the question is worded this way and not another way. The question is not, what is your name? It is not, what are you called? It is not, what did the people who knew you use when they spoke to you? It is, specifically, what name were you given at the hour of your first breath? And the specificity is not stylistic, it is functional. The Cutha priests believed, and the tablet is explicit about this, that every human being received a name at the moment of birth that was distinct from the names that would be given to them later by parents, by families, by communities, by professions, and by the various roles they would grow into. The name given at the first breath was, in their theology, the true name. It was assigned by the figures who were present at the birth, and those figures, in the tablet's cosmology, were not the human midwives or family members who happened to be in the room. They were a separate class of being, invisible to the humans, present at every birth, who assigned the name in a language the humans did not hear. The name assigned in that language was the name Nedu asks for, and the reason he asks for it, and not for any of the other names the soul will have accumulated over the course of a life, is that it is the only name that identifies the soul uniquely, in the record Nedu is keeping, which is the record of every soul that has ever passed through the first gate. The problem this creates, and the tablet is clear that it is a problem, is that almost no human being knows the name that was assigned to them at the hour of their first breath. The humans in the room at the birth did not hear it. The parents did not name the child in that language. The child, growing up, was never told the name, because the name had never been spoken in any language the child could hear. And so the soul, arriving at the first gate, is asked a question to which, in the vast majority of cases, the soul does not know the answer. The tablet lists 4 categories of answer. The first category is the correct answer, which is to say, the name that was actually assigned at the hour of the first breath, spoken by the soul in the language it was assigned in. The tablet does not specify how any soul would ever know this name. It simply notes that the correct answer is possible, and that when it is given, Nedu marks the record, and the gate opens. The second category is the answer of the ordinary name, which is the name the soul was called during its life. This is the answer that, in the tablet's estimation, the overwhelming majority of souls give. It is not the correct answer, but it is a specific and honest answer, and the tablet describes it as the answer of the ignorant but not the deceptive. The third category is the answer of the invented name, which is the answer given by a soul that suspects, or has been told, that the ordinary name is not the correct answer, and that attempts to guess. The fourth category is the answer of silence, which is the answer given by a soul that does not speak at all, either because it has forgotten what it was going to say, or because it has been rendered mute by the sight of Nedu, or because it has decided, for reasons the tablet does not speculate about, not to respond. Each of these four categories carries a specific consequence, and the consequences are cumulative in the sense that they determine what happens at the gates that follow. Not only at the first gate, the soul that gives the correct answer proceeds to the second gate with, in the tablet's phrasing, a mark on the record that identifies it as verified. This mark is not a benefit at the second gate directly, but it becomes relevant at the fourth, and again at the sixth, and it is one of the things the priests were trained to explain to the dying. The soul that gives the answer of the ordinary name proceeds to the second gate with a different mark, which the tablet calls the mark of the honest reply. And this mark is neutral. It confers no advantage and no disadvantage. It simply notes that the soul was truthful about what it knew. The soul that gives the answer of the invented name does not proceed. The tablet is emphatic about this. The gate does not open. The soul is not sent back, and it is not admitted, and it is not assigned to a category. It is held. It is held, in the tablet's language, at the threshold, and it remains there, in a condition the tablet describes as neither passage nor rest, until, at some point that the tablet does not specify, it is called to answer again. When it is called to answer again, it is not given the option of any of the four categories. It is given only two. It may confess that its previous answer was invented, in which case it is admitted with a mark that the tablet calls the mark of the corrected liar. And this mark, though negative, is not fatal at any of the gates that follow, or it may repeat the invented name, in which case the gate closes permanently, and the soul is assigned, immediately, to a condition the tablet names, but does not describe in detail, called the condition of the false name. What that condition is, in practical terms, is one of the questions the assistant curator's report asked in 1920, and it is one of the questions the museum's hold instruction seems to have been intended to prevent from being asked publicly. The tablet does not describe the condition, it only names it, and the naming carries, in the tablet's phrasing, the sense that the condition is the worst of the 7 possible fates that the 7 gates can assign. The fourth category, the answer of silence, is treated separately in the tablet, and it is treated with unusual care. The tablet notes that silence, at the first gate, is not counted as a wrong answer, and it is not counted as a right answer, and it is not, initially, counted as any answer at all. Nedu waits. The tablet does not say how long he waits. It says only that the wait is finite, and that at the end of the wait, if no answer has been given, Nedu himself speaks. What he says, when he speaks, is a phrase that the tablet renders in a way that is difficult to translate, and that has been translated into English by the small number of scholars who have looked at it in 3 different ways. The most common translation is, "Then I will call you what you were called." The second is, "Then I will name you by the sound your throat has forgotten." The third, which is favored by only one scholar, and only in an unpublished note, is, "Then I will speak the name I already know." The 3 translations point in the same general direction, which is that Nedu, if the soul does not answer, will provide an answer himself, and that the answer he provides will be a name. The tablet is not clear on whether this name is the name that was actually assigned at the hour of the first breath, or whether it is a name Nedu invents on the spot, or whether it is some other name entirely. What the tablet is clear on is that the soul, once Nedu has spoken the name, is treated as having answered, and the answer is treated as the correct answer, and the mark is placed on the record, and the gate opens. The soul that remained silent, in other words, is treated more favorably than the soul that invented, and slightly less favorably than the soul that answered honestly with the ordinary name, and it proceeds to the second gate with what the tablet calls the mark of the answered silence. This is the structure of the first gate. 4 possible responses, 4 possible marks, and 1 condition, the condition of the false name, that is assigned immediately and is the worst of the 7 fates. The priests of Kutha, when they trained their students, were required to be able to describe all 4 responses in order with the marks that followed each. They were required to be able to describe them to a family member of the dying in the hours before the death, and the reason they were required to do this the tablet is direct about is that the answer of the invented name is the answer given by souls who have been told, by well-meaning but ignorant advisors, that the ordinary name is not the correct answer, and that they should therefore say something else. That advice, the tablet says, is fatal. It is the single most common source of the condition of the false name, and the priests were trained, above all, to make sure that no dying person, under their care, ever gave the answer of the invented name, because there was no coming back from it, and because the soul that gave it would be assigned to the worst of the 7 conditions, and would remain there, in the tablet's phrasing, for as long as the sequence itself remained in operation, which was, in the theology of Cutha, forever. The tablet, in the section on the first gate, gives one further piece of information, and it is a piece of information that has been noted in the private notes of the 20th century scholars with unusual emphasis. The mark of the honest reply, which is the mark given to the soul that answered with the ordinary name, is described in the tablet as the mark that most souls carry into the second gate. Most souls, in other words, in the tablet's estimation, give the answer of the ordinary name. They do this because they do not know any better answer to give, and because the ordinary name is the true thing they know about themselves, and because they are afraid to say nothing. This is the ordinary path. It is the path the tablet expects most souls to take, and it is the path that leads, without incident and without penalty, to the second gate, where the questioner is not Neddu, and where the question is not about names. The question at the second gate is about something else, and the something else is where the sequence begins, in the tablet's own phrasing, to become difficult. We turn to the second gate now, and to the second questioner, and to the question the tablet reports, in its own words, as the question that most souls, arriving at it, do not know how to answer. There is more to say about the first gate before we leave it, and the tablet says it, and the priests were required to learn it, and it is the part of the first gate material that is, in the opinion of at least 2 of the 20th century scholars whose private notes have survived, the most important part of the entire tablet. It is the section that describes what the mark of the correct answer means for the 6 gates that follow. It is the section that describes, in other words, why the correct answer is worth pursuing, and what happens to a soul that carries it forward. The mark of the correct answer, according to the tablet, is not a mark that Neddu himself places on the soul. It is a mark that appears on the soul at the moment the correct name is spoken, and it is placed there, in the tablet's phrasing, by the same figures who assigned the name at the hour of the first breath. Those figures, invisible to the humans at the birth, invisible to Neddu at the gate, are present at both moments. They do not intervene. They do not testify. They simply place the mark when the mark is warranted, and they leave. What they leave, the tablet says, is a small sign in a location on the soul that the tablet does not specify anatomically, that reads, to the questioners at the later gates, as a statement about the soul that they will trust before they trust anything else the soul says. The statement is not, this soul is good. It is not, this soul is worthy. It is, in the tablet's careful phrasing, this soul is who it says it is. The mark, in other words, is a mark of identity. It certifies that whatever the soul says at the later gates, about what it did in its life, about what it believed, about what it loved, and about what it refused, is being said by the soul that was actually there, in the life, doing and believing and loving and refusing. It is a mark of standing. It gives the soul the standing to speak, at the later gates, in its own voice, about its own experience, and to be heard. The soul that gives the answer of the ordinary name does not receive this mark. It receives, instead, the mark of the honest reply, and the mark of the honest reply is treated, at the later gates, as a provisional identification. It is accepted, but it is accepted with a small note attached. The note says, in the tablet's phrasing, this soul is speaking about a life it lived under a name that was not its own. The questioners at the later gates take this into account. They do not disregard what the soul says, but they weigh it slightly differently. They consider, in each answer, the possibility that the life was lived by a person who did not know the name it had been given, and who therefore may not have known other things about itself as well. The tablet is careful to note that this weighting is not a penalty. It is a caution. The soul with the mark of the honest reply is not disadvantaged in any of the 4 remaining categories at the later gates, in the sense that it can still pass, but it is examined more closely. Its answers are heard, and then examined, and then heard again. And the examination takes what the tablet calls the second listening, which is a phrase that has been translated variously as the reconsideration, the hearing behind the hearing, and the pause before belief. The soul with the mark of the answered silence receives a similar but slightly different treatment. The questioners at the later gates know, when they see the mark, that Nedu himself provided the name. They know that the soul, at the first gate, either could not or would not speak, and they treat this, in the tablet's phrasing, as a sign of one of two things. Either the soul had something in its life it did not want to name, and the not wanting had followed it to the gate, or the soul, in the moment of arrival, had been overwhelmed and had lost the ability to speak, and would recover it, and the recovery would show itself in the answers given at the later gates. The questioners, the tablet says, listen for which of these two conditions is present. If the soul recovers and speaks with clarity at the second gate, the mark of the answered silence is quietly set aside, and the soul is treated, from that point, as if it had answered honestly. If the soul does not recover and remains hesitant or evasive at the second gate, the mark of the answered silence is upgraded, in the record, to a different mark, called the mark of the soul that would not be named, and this mark is treated, at the gates that follow, as a heavy caution. The mark of the corrected liar, which is given to the soul that confessed to its invented answer and was admitted on the second try, is the most difficult of the first gate marks to interpret at the later gates. The tablet is direct that the mark itself, once given, is not fatal at any of the 6 remaining gates, but it is also direct that the mark carries, into every later question, a specific implication. The implication is that the soul, at least once in its process, chose to say something it knew to be untrue, and then, when confronted, chose to confess rather than repeat. The tablet says that the questioners at the later gates treat this as important information about how the soul is likely to handle pressure. A soul that lied once and confessed is a soul that, under pressure, first evades and then relents. That pattern, the tablet says, is a pattern the questioners at the later gates have seen before, and they have their own methods of testing it, and the soul that carries the mark of the corrected liar can expect, at each of the later gates, to be pressed slightly harder than a soul that did not carry it. The pressing is not, in the tablet's phrasing, a punishment, it is a test, and the soul that passes the test, despite the mark, is treated at the later gates the same as any other soul. But the pressing itself, the tablet notes, is a difficult experience, and the soul that carries the mark of the corrected liar should expect, at each gate, to feel the pressure and to be aware that the pressure is a consequence of the earlier choice. These 4 marks, then, are the 4 possible outcomes of the first gate, other than the immediate assignment to the condition of the false name that follows from repeating an invented answer on the second try. The tablet, in the closing lines of the first gate section, offers a final observation, and the observation is one of the passages that the 20th century scholars noted with the most concern. The observation is that the correct answer, the true name given at the hour of the first breath, is possible to know. The tablet says this. It says it in a way that suggests, without stating explicitly, that there are and have been practices, in the temples and elsewhere, by which a living person can, in principle, come to learn the name that was assigned to them at their own birth. The tablet does not describe those practices. It does not name them. It says only that the practices exist, and that they are difficult, and that they are not, in the tablet's own phrase, for everyone. And it says that the soul that has learned its true name during life will, at the first gate, be able to give it, and to receive the mark of the correct answer, and to carry that mark forward through the 6 gates that follow, and to arrive at the 7th gate, if it reaches it, with the standing that the mark confers. The scholars in the 20th century, in the private notes that survive, spent considerable time on this observation. They agreed that the tablet was pointing, without stating, to a body of temple practice that was not preserved in any of the other Kutha material that has come out of the ground. They disagreed about whether the practice had ever actually existed, or whether it was, as one of them put it, a theological courtesy, offered to the general population as a way of preserving the sense that the correct answer was, in principle, attainable, without any real expectation that anyone would ever attain it. 2 of the scholars believed the practice was real, and that some record of it had once existed at Mesopotamian, and that the record had been destroyed, deliberately, at some point before the excavations began, by parties who did not want the practice to be transmitted. One of them believed the practice was still, in his own time, being transmitted, somewhere, in a form he was not able to identify. The others believed the tablet was, on this point, being generous with the truth. None of them, in the notes, argued that the observation should be ignored. All of them agreed that the tablet had made a specific claim, and that the claim was one of the things the museum had, in the end, decided was best not published. The soul that carries no mark, because it has been assigned to the condition of the false name, does not proceed to the second gate. It does not proceed to any gate. It remains, in the tablet's phrasing, at the place where the first question was asked, and its condition, from that moment, is a condition of permanent misidentification. The tablet does not say what this feels like. It does not describe the experience of the condition. It says only that the soul in that condition is, and will remain, someone other than itself, in the record that is kept of it, and in the treatment it receives from every figure that has cause, thereafter, to interact with it. It is, in the theology of Cutha, the fate of the soul that lied about who it was, and that repeated the lie when given the chance to correct it, and that therefore forfeited, permanently, the standing that would have allowed it to pass through the remaining gates as itself. It is the first of the 7 fates. It is the least described. And, in the estimation of the priests who taught the tablet, it is the fate the priests worked hardest to prevent, because it was the fate that resulted, more often than any of the others, from bad advice given at the deathbed by people who meant well. The second gate is where the soul that survived the first arrives, with whichever of the 4 marks it carried out of it, ready to be asked the second question. The second question, the tablet is careful to note, is not connected to the first. It does not build on the first. It is a separate question, asked by a separate questioner, about a separate feature of the soul's life. And what it is about is the thing every human being carries with them out of a life, whether or not they knew, in the living of it, that they were carrying it. The second gate. Its questioner is named Endashirima, which is a compound name in the older Sumerian, and which the tablet, in one of its rare explanatory notes, translates as the one who knows what was taken. Endashirima is not a figure who appears in any of the other surviving Sumerian mythological literature. He is present only in the Cutha material. His name is not in the god lists. His iconography, so far as any has been preserved, is not attested. He is, so far as the modern record can tell, a Cutha-specific figure, invented or revealed only within the theology of Meslam, and known only to the priests who trained there. The scholars who have looked at his name have noted that it uses a grammatical construction that suggests he is not a god in the traditional sense, but a role, or a function, that could be occupied by different figures at different times. What his name says is that whoever stands in this position, at this gate, is the being who knows what was taken. And what he asks the soul that arrives at his gate is the question that follows from that knowledge. The question is this: what did you owe that you did not repay? The Cutha priests understood, and the tablet is direct, that this question is not a moral question in the ordinary sense. It is not about wrongdoing. It is not about sin. It is about, specifically and only, debt. And debt, in the tablet's framing, is a category that includes, but is not limited to financial debt. It includes any obligation, of any kind, that the soul incurred during its life, and that the soul did not, before dying, discharge. This includes money borrowed and not returned. It includes promises made and not kept. It includes assistance received and not, in some manner, requited. It includes injuries done that were not, before death, apologized for or made good. It includes, and this is the part of the tablet's framing that has troubled every scholar who has read it, the debts the soul incurred without knowing it, the kindness done to it as a child, the teaching given to it by figures whose names it never learned, the forbearance of neighbors and strangers whose forbearance the soul never registered as a gift. All of these, in the theology of Cutha, are debts. All of them are owed, and Endashirima knows about every one of them. That is what his name means. He is the one who knows what was taken, and what he means by taken is not what is normally meant. He does not mean stolen. He means received. Every gift, every service, every act of care that was received by the soul during its life, and that was not, in some form and at some point, returned or acknowledged or repaid, is a taking in the tablet's framing, because the soul carried it away without ever setting anything in exchange. And Endashirima keeps the record. He has been keeping the record from the moment the soul was born. His record includes every transaction of every kind, from the largest debts to the smallest, from the debts the soul knew about to the debts it never noticed. And when the soul arrives at his gate, he asks the single question that his role permits him to ask. What did you owe that you did not repay? The soul, at this gate, is not being asked to list the debts. The tablet is emphatic about this. Endashirima already knows the debts. He has the record. He does not need the soul to inventory them. What he is asking, instead, is whether the soul knows about them, and whether the soul can name, in the moment of the question, the debts that were most significant. The tablet does not define significant in the sense that would allow the soul to prepare a list in advance. Significant, in the tablet's framing, is a category that shifts. Different debts are significant at different times, and the soul's job, at the second gate, is to know, in the moment, which of its debts Endashirima is asking about, and to name them, in order, without hesitation. This is the question the priests were most concerned about, and the tablet spends more material on the response categories at the second gate than at any of the gates that follow. There are, again, 4 categories of answer, but the categories at the second gate are structured differently from the categories at the first. At the first gate, the categories were about what was said. At the second, they are about what is remembered. The 4 categories are these: the soul that names its most significant debts, in order and correctly; the soul that names some of its debts, in some order, with some correctness; the soul that names debts that are not, in fact, the most significant; and the soul that says it owes nothing. The soul that names its most significant debts, in order and correctly, receives the mark that the tablet calls the mark of the whole reckoning. This mark, like the mark of the correct answer at the first gate, is not placed by Endashirima. It is placed by the same figures who assigned the name at the first breath, and it is placed at the moment the soul, in its own answer, arrives at the truth of what it owed. The mark is a mark of, in the tablet's phrasing, moral consciousness. It says, about the soul, that the soul knew, while it was alive, what it owed, and that the soul carried this knowledge with it into death. It says that the soul, though it may not have repaid every debt, was aware of every debt, and was aware, in particular, of the debts that mattered most. The mark, at the later gates, functions as evidence that the soul is a soul that can be trusted to know things about itself. It weighs in the soul's favor at the third gate directly, and at the fifth gate indirectly, and at the seventh gate, in a way the tablet does not fully explain, decisively. The soul that names some of its debts, in some order, with some correctness, receives the mark of the partial reckoning. This is the mark, the tablet says, that most souls receive at the second gate. Most souls know some of what they owed. Most souls have forgotten some of what they owed. Most souls, when asked, will produce a list that is partly right and partly wrong. The mark of the partial reckoning is the mark that says, about the soul, that the soul tried, that the soul was honest to the limits of its memory, and that the soul was not deceived about the fundamental fact of having incurred debts during its life. This mark, at the later gates, is neutral in the same way the mark of the honest reply at the first gate was neutral. It confers neither advantage nor disadvantage. It simply establishes that the soul, at this gate, did what most souls do. The soul that names debts that are not, in fact, the most significant, receives the mark that the tablet calls the mark of the mistaken reckoning. This is the mark, the tablet is careful to note, that follows from a specific and characteristic error. The error is not the error of forgetting, it is the error of overvaluing. The soul that names, as its most significant debt, a small monetary loan that was easily forgotten, while failing to name a much larger debt of kindness or care, has made the error of the mistaken reckoning. It has confused the visible with the important. It has treated the debts that were formally documented as more significant than the debts that were, in fact, more consequential. The tablet says that this error is characteristic of souls that lived under systems in which certain kinds of debts were tracked and others were not, and that the error is, in that sense, structural rather than personal. Endashirima does not treat the mark of the mistaken reckoning as evidence of moral failure. He treats it, in the tablet's phrasing, as evidence of a specific kind of blindness, and the mark, at the later gates, functions as a caution, similar to the mark of the corrected liar, that the questioners take into account when weighing the soul's later answers. The soul that carries the mark of the mistaken reckoning is a soul that has, at least once, confused what mattered with what was recorded, and the questioners at the later gates will listen, in each answer, for whether the confusion persists. The soul that says it owes nothing receives no mark. It is, at this gate, in a position similar to the soul at the first gate that gave the answer of the invented name. It is held, Endashirima does not accept the answer. He does not send the soul back, and he does not admit it, and he does not assign it. He holds it, in the tablet's phrasing, at the threshold, and he waits. What he is waiting for is the soul to reconsider. The tablet says that most souls, when held at this threshold, do reconsider, and that the reconsideration takes the form of the soul over what the tablet describes as an indeterminate but finite period, remembering debts that the soul had forgotten in life come back to it at the threshold. Debts it had not noticed become visible. The kindnesses of childhood, the teachings of unnamed teachers, the forbearances of neighbors, all of these begin to appear in the soul's own awareness, and the soul begins to see the record that Endashirima has been keeping. This process, the tablet says, is not pleasant. It is the moment in the sequence of the 7 gates that most souls describe in the later underworld literature that references the tablet as the moment of the seeing. And what the soul does with what it sees in that moment determines what happens next. The soul that reconsiders and that names its debts in whatever order and with whatever accuracy is admitted. The mark it receives is the mark of the partial reckoning, and it proceeds to the 3rd gate on the same terms as any other soul that received that mark. The soul that does not reconsider, and that continues to insist that it owes nothing, does not proceed. The gate does not open, and the soul is assigned, immediately, to a condition the tablet names, but again does not describe in detail, called the condition of the empty ledger. What that condition is, in practical terms, is another of the questions the museum's hold instruction seems to have been intended to prevent from being asked publicly. The tablet does not describe it, it only names it. And the naming carries, in the tablet's phrasing, the sense that the condition is not, in itself, the worst of the 7 fates, but is a condition of a specific kind of isolation in which the soul is treated by the figures of the underworld as if it did not, in fact, have any connection to any other being, ever, in the record of its existence. It is, in the theology of Kutha, the fate of the soul that denied its own dependencies. And the priests were trained to warn the dying against it, above all, by explaining, in advance, that Endashirima's question was not a trap, that the correct response was not to claim purity, and that the soul that said it owed nothing was making the specific mistake of confusing the absence of memory with the absence of debt. There is one further feature of the 2nd gate that the tablet describes, and it is a feature that the 20th century scholars noted in the private material that survives, with the same emphasis they gave to the observation about the true name at the 1st gate. Endashirima, according to the tablet, sometimes speaks after the soul has answered. He does not always. Most souls receive their mark and pass, and the gate closes behind them without further comment. But some souls, and the tablet does not specify which ones, or on what basis, hear from Endashirima, after their answer, a single additional statement. The statement is not a comment on the answer. It is not a correction. It is, in the tablet's phrasing, a naming of one debt that the soul did not name. Endashirima tells the soul, in these cases, the identity of one being to whom the soul owed something, that the soul had not, in its answer, mentioned. The being is named, the debt is named, and the soul is not asked to do anything about it. The information is simply given, and the soul is dismissed to the 3rd gate. The scholars in the 20th century disagreed, in their notes, about what this feature means. Some believed it was a mercy, a final gift to certain souls, a piece of information about their lives that they would carry into whatever fate followed, with the sense that at least one thing had been made clear to them at the end. Others believed it was a burden, a naming of a debt the soul would now be unable to repay, and would carry into the underworld as an open wound in the record. One of the scholars, in a note that survives only in a photograph of a page from his working copy, wrote that the naming was neither a mercy nor a burden. He wrote that it was a message, that Endashirima, in naming the debt, was sending information forward, through the soul, to the underworld, about who the soul had, in its life, been in relation to, and that the information, once delivered, would be used by the figures of the underworld, for purposes the scholar did not attempt to guess. The tablet does not resolve this disagreement. It says only that the naming happens, and that it is unpredictable, and that the soul that receives it should treat it, in the tablet's own phrase, as a thing given and not as a thing owed. Whatever it means, it is one of the things that the 2nd gate distinguishes itself from the other 6 by including, and it is one of the things the priests were required to know how to explain, in the days before the death, to the family of the dying. The soul that has passed the 2nd gate, with whichever of the 3 surviving marks it received, proceeds now to the 3rd gate. The 3rd questioner is not Endashirima. The 3rd question is not about debts. It is about something that, in the tablet's own framing, is more difficult to speak about and more difficult to answer than either of the two questions that came before it. Before we move to the third gate, there is a passage in the second gate section that is worth reading closely, because it addresses a question that most modern readers of the tablet want to ask, and that the 20th century scholars, in their notes, it spent considerable time on. The question is why the debts are treated, in the tablet, as unrepayable at the point of death. If Endashirima has the record, and the soul, at the threshold, comes to see the record, and the soul recognizes what it owed and to whom, why is the soul not, at that moment, permitted to make good? Why is the soul not sent back, briefly, or given some form of proxy, or allowed to send some kind of signal to the living, so that the debts can be discharged and the record cleared? The tablet addresses this question in what appears to be an anticipated objection, and its answer is direct. The answer is that the point of death is the point at which the account is closed. The Kutha priests understood, and the tablet is explicit, that the value of a debt is not only the value of the thing owed, it is also the value of the timing. A debt repaid during life, at any point before the death, is a debt repaid with the currency of the living, which is time, and attention, and effort, and the transfer of goods that the living can transfer. A debt repaid after death, if such a thing were possible, would be a debt repaid with a different currency, one that the living can no longer produce, and that Endashirima, in the Kutha theology, has no authority to accept. He can only note what was owed and what was not repaid. He cannot open the ledger to new entries. That authority belongs to the living, and the living have used it, or not used it, in each case, according to what they did during their lives, and the moment of death is the moment at which the authority passes out of the soul's hands and into Endashirima's. The priests, when they taught this, taught it as one of the most important reasons that the theology of Kutha placed such heavy emphasis on the discharge of debts during life. It was not, in the priest's framing, a moral matter alone. It was a matter of timing. Debts that were still owed at the moment of death were debts that could never thereafter be discharged. They would be named at the gate or not named, and either way they would remain on the record forever. And the soul that had left them would carry whatever mark it received, the knowledge that some part of its account, closed at death, was closed with entries still open. The priests were, on this point, in the tablet's phrasing, the most direct. They said, in the training material that survives, that the single most important preparation for the 7 gates was not the memorization of the questions. It was the discharge, during life, of every debt the soul could remember, and of every debt the soul could be made to remember by the questioning of a trusted advisor. To die with the account clean, or as clean as the soul could get it, was the preparation. Everything else, in the theology of Kutha, was secondary. The tablet notes, in a passage that has been read closely by the scholars who have looked at it, that this preparation was not, in practice, common. Most souls did not, in life, undertake it. Most souls arrived at the second gate with substantial outstanding accounts, and received the mark of the partial reckoning, and proceeded. This was the ordinary condition. The priests were not, in the tablet's framing, expecting the ordinary to change. What they were expecting, and what they were trying to make possible, was that a small number of souls, in each generation, would undertake the preparation and would arrive at the second gate with the account as clean as any living being can bring it, and would receive the mark of the whole reckoning, and would carry it forward. Those souls, the tablet says, were the ones the sequence had been described in writing, for those souls were the ones the priesthood existed to serve. The rest, the tablet does not say and does not need to say, would receive what the ordinary condition assigned them, and would pass through the gates, and would be sorted, and would occupy, thereafter, whatever position in the underworld the sorting assigned. The theology of Kutha was, in its own understanding of itself, a theology of the exception. It described the ordinary because the ordinary had to be described. It taught the exception because the exception was what the teaching was for. This is worth stating, before we go on, because it changes the way the remaining 5 gates should be understood. The tablet, in describing what happens at each gate, is describing what happens to every soul. It is describing the sorting mechanism. But the tablet, in its own emphasis and in the priest's own training, is not equally interested in every outcome. It is interested, most, in the outcome that leads to the 7th mark and the position of the one who was not stopped. The other outcomes are described because they exist. They are described because the family of the dying needs to know what the ordinary path leads to. But the description that the tablet is, in the deepest sense, providing, is a description of the exceptional path. the path that begins with the correct answer at the first gate. That receives the mark of the whole reckoning at the second. That passes through the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth without incident. And that arrives at the seventh, in a condition to receive the seventh mark, which is the mark that opens onto the position the tablet, in its final broken lines, tries to describe. We turn, now, to the third gate, and to the third questioner, and to the question that, according to the tablet and according to the priests, was the question at which the exceptional path first became genuinely difficult to walk. The third gate, its questioner is named Bitu, which is a Sumerian word that means, in its ordinary usage, the second doorkeeper, and which carries, in the context of the tablet, the implication of a figure who stands at the boundary between the outer sequence and the inner. Bitu is present in the descent of Inanna, briefly, as the porter of the second gate, and there he does nothing more than open the door and take the surrendered object. In the Kutha tablet, his function is fully articulated, and it is a function that has, in the private notes of the 20th century scholars, been the subject of more debate than any other single figure in the seven. The question Bitu asks is this: whose blood did you carry? The question is deliberately ambiguous in the Sumerian, and the ambiguity, the tablet notes, is not accidental. The word that is being translated as blood is a word that meant, in the older texts, both the physical fluid and the line of descent. It meant blood in the sense of what runs in veins, and it meant blood in the sense of what runs through generations. And Bitu, when he asks the question, is asking, in a single word, both things at once. Whose blood, physically, did the soul carry in its own body during the life? Whose blood, ancestrally, did the soul carry as inheritance? And the tablet notes, in the material immediately following the question, that the soul is expected to answer both meanings in the same reply, without being told that they are different meanings. This is where the tablet begins to be, in the phrasing of one of the 20th century scholars, cruel. The first two gates ask questions that a soul could reasonably prepare for, if it had been taught, and if it had the material to work with. The name given at the first breath was, in principle, knowable. The debts owed at the point of death were, in principle, recallable. But the question of whose blood the soul carried, in the double meaning Bitu intends, is a question that requires the soul to know, and to be able to state, in the moment of the question, the identity of every biological ancestor whose material contributed to the body the soul inhabited, and the identity of every ancestor whose choices, over the generations, had shaped the conditions under which the soul had lived. The former is a matter of biology, the latter is a matter of history, and the soul is expected, in the tablet's framing, to name both. The four categories of answer at the third gate are structured around the double meaning. The soul that names both the biological line and the historical line, correctly, receives the mark of the full inheritance. The soul that names the biological line only, and does so correctly, receives the mark of the body known. The soul that names the historical line only, and does so correctly, receives the mark of the story known. And the soul that names neither, or that names them incorrectly, receives, depending on the specific error, one of two different treatments, one of which is a hold at the threshold, and the other of which is an immediate assignment to a condition. The mark of the full inheritance is, in the tablet's framing, the mark that carries the greatest weight forward. It is the mark that says, about the soul, that the soul knew where it came from, in both senses, and that the soul had, during its life, undertaken the work of learning what had been given to it, biologically and historically, before it was born. This work, the priests taught, was not, in the ordinary case, complete. Most souls did not know the names of their great-grandparents. Most souls did not know the events that had shaped the lives of their grandparents. Most souls, when asked, could name a father and a mother, and perhaps a father's father, and could describe, in broad terms, the region from which the family had come, and could produce nothing more. This was the ordinary condition, and it was the condition that led, in most cases, to the mark of the body known, or to a version of the mark of the story known, depending on which side of the inheritance the soul had, in life, paid more attention to. The mark of the body known is the mark that says, about the soul, that the soul knew the biological line but did not know the historical. It is a mark that is common among souls that came from stable communities in which the family names were preserved but the family stories were not. It is a mark that Bitu accepts and that carries the soul forward, but that carries with it a caution at the later gates, similar in weight to the mark of the honest reply at the first gate. The caution is that the soul, though it knew what it was made of, did not know what had made it, It knew the material but not the history. And the questioners at the later gates, in reading the mark, will consider, in each of the soul's later answers, the possibility that the soul may have understood its life in the same partial way, may have known what it did without knowing why, may have known its choices without knowing the conditions under which the choices had been made. The mark of the body known is not a penalty, it is a note, and the note is that the soul is a soul that knew half of what it could have known. The mark of the story known is the reverse. It is the mark of the soul that knew the history but not the biology. This is a rarer mark, in the tablet's estimation, than the mark of the body known, because the biology is, in most communities, the piece of the inheritance that is preserved most reliably, but it exists. The tablet describes it as the mark of, most commonly, the soul that was adopted, or that was raised outside of its biological line, and that had come to know the history of the family it had been raised into without ever knowing the biological line it had come from. Bitu accepts this mark and treats it with the same weight as the mark of the body known, and passes the soul forward. The caution is the mirror image. The soul knew the history but not the material. It knew what it had inherited in the way of story and expectation and shaping, but it did not know what had been given to it, physically, at conception. The questioners at the later gates weigh this, at each answer, in the same way they weigh the mark of the body known, and for the same reason. The soul that names neither, or that names them incorrectly, is treated in one of two ways, and the two ways depend on a distinction that the tablet is careful to draw. The distinction is between the soul that does not know, and the soul that has forgotten, and the soul that has refused to know. The first is the soul that lived in circumstances that made the inheritance unrecoverable. War, displacement, the destruction of records, the death, before the soul was old enough to ask, of every person who could have told it. This soul, the tablet says, is not held responsible for what it could not know. It is admitted at the third gate with the mark that Bitu himself confers, called the mark of the interrupted line. This mark is the tablet's acknowledgement that the sequence, in this case, has encountered a soul whose inheritance was broken by force, and that the soul is not to be treated as if the break had been the soul's own choice. The mark is neutral at the later gates, and it functions, at the fifth gate especially, as a positive weight, because the fifth gate asks a question that the soul, with the mark of the interrupted line is, in the tablet's phrasing, especially well positioned to answer. The soul that has refused to know, in contrast, is the soul that had the material available and did not learn it. This is the soul that could have asked the questions and did not. That could have read the records and did not. That could have sat with the elders and did not. This soul is not admitted at the third gate. It is held, and the hold is not, in this case, an invitation to reconsider. It is, in the tablet's phrasing, an invitation to describe. The soul is asked, by Bitu, to explain what it did with the time in which it could have learned. And the explanation, whatever it is taken by Bitu into account. If the explanation reveals that the soul was, in fact, occupied with matters that the tablet, in a phrase that is difficult to translate but has been rendered as the demands of the living, prevented it from undertaking the learning, the soul is admitted with a version of the mark of the interrupted line, called the mark of the postponed inheritance. If the explanation reveals that the soul simply had not thought to ask, and had not, in fact, been prevented from asking, the soul is assigned to a condition the tablet calls the condition of the unbound line. And this condition, in the tablet's own naming, is a condition of, in a phrase that has been translated as, being no one's child. It is not, in the tablet's ranking, the worst of the 7 fates. But it is the fate the tablet spends the most words describing, because it is the fate that the priests believed was most preventable, by the simple act of asking, during life, the questions the soul could have asked. The soul that is forgotten, and that is neither the soul of the interrupted line nor the soul that refused to know, is treated with more latitude than either. Bitu, in these cases, provides. He speaks. What he says is, in the tablet's phrasing, the names. He gives the soul, in the moment of the question, the identity of one biological ancestor and one historical event. The soul is then asked to hold these 2 pieces of information, and to see, in the holding, whether the rest of the inheritance returns. The tablet says that the soul, in most cases, when given the 2 pieces of information, begins to remember. Names return, events return, the line, biological and historical, reassembles itself in the soul's awareness. And the soul is then permitted to answer the original question, with the material that has been returned to it, and is admitted with the mark of the recovered inheritance. This mark is, in the tablet's framing, a version of the mark of the full inheritance, but weighted slightly lighter, because the soul did not, in life, do the work of the recovery. It was done for the soul, at the gate, by Bitu himself. And the mark carries, into the later gates, a note that says, about the soul, that it was capable of holding the inheritance when it was given, but had not, on its own, retrieved it. There is a further category, in the third gate section, that the tablet describes in a passage that the 20th century scholars flagged as one of the passages most likely to have been what the museum was trying to hold. The category is the category of the soul that had been given the inheritance, in some form, by parties who were not its biological or historical family. The soul that had been taught, by an outside teacher, the story of a line that was not its own, and that had come to identify with that line, and to carry it, in the historical sense, into its own life. The tablet does not condemn this. It does not treat it as an error. But it treats it, in Bitu's questioning, as a special case, and it describes a specific response for it. The soul, at the gate, is asked to name the line it carried, and to name, separately, the line it was actually descended from. If the soul can name both, and can distinguish them, and can describe the relationship between them, it is admitted with a mark that the tablet calls the mark of the two lines. This mark, at the later gates, is treated with the greatest care. It is not weighted for or against the soul in any of the later answers, but it is, in every case, noted, and the questioners, at each later gate, listen for whether the soul is speaking, in its later answers, as the soul of its biological line, as the soul of the taught line, or as some third being that is neither. The soul that carries the mark of the two lines is, in the tablet's framing, a soul that has done something specific during its life, and the specific thing is, in the tablet's own phrase, worth attending to. The scholars in the 20th century were divided, in their notes, on what to make of this category. Some of them believed that the tablet was, in this passage, describing the priesthood itself. The priests of Cutha, in the training material that survives, were not, in most cases, biological descendants of earlier priests. They were, in most cases, brought into the priesthood as adolescents, taught the lineage of Meslam as their own, and, in the theological framing of the training, made into descendants of the first priest by the fact of the teaching. The mark of the two lines, in this reading, is the mark the priests themselves expected to receive, and the questioning at the third gate was, in this reading, designed with the priesthood's own case in mind. Other scholars disagreed. They believed the passage was describing something broader, a category of persons, in the ancient world and perhaps also in later worlds, who had taken up an inheritance that was not biologically theirs, and had lived out its terms, and had brought the double inheritance to the gate: adopted children, converts, members of guilds and orders that transmitted a lineage of practice rather than blood. All of these, in this reading, would carry the mark of the two lines. And the tablet, in its careful framing of the category, would be describing not the priesthood alone, but the general phenomenon. Whichever reading is correct, and the tablet does not resolve it, the mark of the two lines is one of the two most distinctive marks that can be received at the third gate. The other is the mark of the full inheritance. And the two of them, in different ways, both signal to the later questioners that the soul had done, during its life, work of a kind that most souls do not do. The soul that arrives at the fourth gate with either of these two marks is, in the priest's training, a soul that the fourth questioner will treat with a specific kind of attention. The nature of that attention and the nature of the fourth question is what we turn to now. Before we cross into the fourth gate, there is more the tablet says about Bitu and about the third question that has been noted in the private notes of the 20th century scholars as one of the sections that helps explain the museum's decision. The section is the section that describes what happens at the third gate to souls of two particular categories that were, in the ancient world, common, and that remain, in the modern world, extremely common. The first is the category of the soul that was born from an inheritance it had reason to reject. The second is the category of the soul that inherited a debt it did not know about, and that Endashirima had counted against it at the second gate. The first category, the soul that was born from an inheritance it had reason to reject, is, in the tablet's framing, the soul that emerged from a biological or historical line that had, in some way, done harm. The soul of a person whose ancestors were violent. The soul of a person whose community had committed acts that the soul, in living, had come to disavow. The soul of a person who had, in some formal or informal way, separated themselves from what their line had done, and had tried to live in a way that broke the pattern the line was carrying. Bitu, in the tablet's framing, is not indifferent to this soul. He does not ask the soul to affirm what the line had done, or to name it with pride. He asks only for the naming, and the naming, in this case, is the naming of what actually was, which may include violence, and may include harm, and may include acts. The soul is uncomfortable to speak. The tablet is emphatic that the soul, in this case, must name what actually was. It cannot claim a different line. It cannot substitute a cleaner history for the one it was actually descended from. If it does either of these things, it does what the tablet, in a rare direct phrase, calls the theft of a lineage, and the theft of a lineage is treated as a version of the answer of the invented name at the first gate. It leads, on the second try, to a permanent assignment. The tablet is not, in this passage, sympathetic. It notes that the soul had every right, during life, to disavow what its line had done. It notes that the disavowal, in life, may have been the soul's most important act, and the act that most defined its life. But the disavowal, the tablet says, is not the same as the substitution. The soul may disavow, and still name what it disavowed. The soul may reject, and still say what it rejected. And Bitu is asking for the naming, which is a factual question, not for the endorsement, which would be a moral question. The soul that names the difficult inheritance, and that describes, at the moment of the naming, its own relationship to it, receives a mark that the tablet calls the mark of the acknowledged line. This mark is a heavy mark in the priest's training, and it is a mark that the tablet describes as one of the marks that most helps the soul at the later gates. It says, about the soul, that the soul had done, in life, the specific work of seeing clearly what it had come from, and that the soul had not, in its response to that clarity, either denied or run. It had held the knowledge, it had carried it, and it had brought it, at the moment of the question, to the gate. The mark of the acknowledged line is one of the marks that, the 20th century scholars noted, seems to have been considered by the priests of Cutha as strong evidence that the soul was one of the exceptional cases the theology was ultimately organized around. Not because the soul had a clean inheritance, but because the soul had, in its own life, worked with what it had inherited. The second category is the category of the soul that inherited a debt it did not know about. Endashirima, at the second gate, keeps a record that includes not only the debts the soul incurred in its own life, but the debts that were passed to the soul from earlier generations, and that the soul, in its own generation, was carrying without having created. The debts of parents, the debts of grandparents, the obligations that had gone unresolved in earlier generations, and that had, in the tablet's cosmology, transferred to the descendants who had not yet, in their own lives, discharged them. These debts, in the second gate's accounting, may or may not have been named by the soul in its answer to Endashirima. The tablet says that the soul that has inherited a debt without knowing about it, and that therefore did not name it, is not penalized at the second gate for the failure to name. Endashirima understands that inherited debts are, in most cases, invisible to the soul that is carrying them. He notes the debt on the record, and he lets the soul pass, with the mark of the partial reckoning, and the debt remains, in the record, unresolved. At the third gate, this becomes relevant. Bitu, in his question, is asking about the line, and the line, in the second sense, includes the debts. The soul that names the historical inheritance correctly, and that names, in its naming, the debts that were passed to it, receives a version of the mark of the full inheritance that carries additional weight. The tablet calls this weighted version the mark of the accepted burden. It says, about the soul, that the soul knew what its line had left undischarged, and that the soul had, in its life, taken up the burden, whether or not it had been able to complete the discharge. The soul that carries the mark of the accepted burden, in the tablet's framing, is a soul that had done, in life, the second kind of exceptional work. Not the work of seeing clearly what it had come from, but the work of taking, into its own life, what earlier generations had failed to do. These two marks, the mark of the acknowledged line and the mark of the accepted burden, together with the mark of the full inheritance and the mark of the two lines, form the four heavy marks of the third gate. The soul that carries any of them into the fourth gate is a soul that the questioners at the later gates will treat with the specific kind of attention the priests were trained to describe. The nature of that attention, the priests taught, was not preferential in the sense of favoritism. It was attentive in the sense that the questioners would listen, in each of the later answers, for whether the soul had, in life, continued to do the kind of work these marks reflected. The heavy marks at the third gate are not credits, they are indicators. They tell the questioners at the later gates what to look for. And the soul, in giving its later answers, is required to demonstrate, in each answer, that the indicator was accurate. The tablet, in the closing lines of the third gate section, makes one further observation, and it is an observation that has been noted in the 20th century private material with the same seriousness as the observation about the true name and the observation about the naming of the debt. The observation is that the third gate, in its treatment of inheritance, does not, in any of its four categories, treat the biological and historical inheritances as separable in the way modern readers might expect. The soul that carries a difficult biological inheritance and a clean historical one is not, in the tablet's framing, half a good soul and half a bad soul. It is a soul that has, in its life, held both, and its response to both is what Bitu is listening for. The soul that carries a clean biological inheritance and a difficult historical one is treated in the same way. Bitu, in the tablet's phrasing, is not sorting the inheritance. He is sorting the soul's response to the inheritance. And the response, whatever the material of the inheritance was, is the thing that determines which mark the soul carries out of the third gate. A soul with a difficult inheritance who has done the work of acknowledgement and burden-taking may leave the third gate with heavier marks than a soul with an easy inheritance who has done neither. The tablet, in this framing, is describing a theology in which the material of the inheritance is not, in itself, decisive. What is decisive is what the soul, given the material, did. This is a distinctive claim, and it is a claim that the 20th century scholars, in their notes, spent considerable time on. They agreed that it was not the ordinary theological position of the ancient Mesopotamian world. The ordinary position, in most of the god lists and most of the myths, is that the inheritance itself is what matters. The soul of the noble is treated differently from the soul of the servant. The soul of the citizen is treated differently from the soul of the foreigner. The soul of the priest is treated differently from the soul of the layman. In the ordinary theology, these differences are decisive, and they follow the soul into the underworld. The Kutha tablet is not, in the third gate section, describing that theology. It is describing something else. And what it is describing, one of the scholars wrote in a note that survives in a private collection, is a theology in which the inheritance is neutral, and in which the soul is judged, at the third gate, not on where it came from, but on what it did with where it came from. That framing, the scholars agreed, is one of the reasons the tablet has been treated by the museum, and by the small number of institutions that have known about it, with the caution they have shown. The tablet is not, in the third gate section, a Mesopotamian text of the ordinary kind. It is a text that describes an unusual theology. And the unusual theology is one that has, in various forms, appeared in various later religious traditions, and that the museum, in the specific historical moment in which it acquired the tablet and translated it, may have had reasons of its own for not wanting to add to. Whether or not that is the reason for the hold instruction, the tablet says what it says, and the third gate section describes what it describes, and the soul that passes the third gate, with whichever mark it received, proceeds now to the fourth. The fourth questioner, the fourth question, and the specific way in which the fourth gate operates on the soul that has come this far are what we turn to now. Before the fourth gate, stop for a second. What you heard about the third gate only makes sense next to the 6 resets before it. Every reset wiped one design. The 8th is loading now. It is all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. QR code is on your screen. The fourth gate, its questioner is named Endashurbanda, which the tablet, in another of its rare explanatory notes, translates as the one who hears what was not said. Endashurbanda is, like Endashurima at the second gate, a Kutha-specific figure. He does not appear in the general god lists. He is not present in the other underworld texts. He is a function of the Kutha theology, and his function, in the sequence, is to test the soul on a category of activity that the tablet treats as separate from the categories tested at the first 3 gates. The question Endashurbanda asks is this: what did you refuse to say? The question, the tablet notes, is not about what the soul did not know how to say. It is not about what the soul did not have the words for. It is about, specifically, the things the soul knew, and could have said, and chose not to say. The refusals of speech, the withholdings of testimony, the moments in which the soul, in its life, was in a position to speak, and had something to speak about, and did not speak. The tablet is direct that this category, more than any of the categories at the first 3 gates, is a category the soul may have difficulty naming, because the soul may not have thought of the refusals as refusals. The soul may have thought of them as silences, as politenesses, as choices about timing that could be revisited later, as courtesies to people who did not need to hear what the soul had to say. The tablet says that these are, in the fourth gate's accounting, all the same thing. They are refusals, and Endashrbanda has the record of them. He does not have the record of every silence. The tablet is careful to draw this distinction. Silence, in itself, is not what he is testing for. The soul that was silent because it had nothing to say is not, in his framing, at fault. The soul that was silent because the situation did not permit speech is not, in his framing, at fault. The soul that was silent because it was afraid, or because it was tired, or because it had judged, in the moment, that the speech would do no good, may or may not be at fault, and the fourth gate is where the sorting between these categories happens. What Endashrbanda has the record of, specifically, is the moments in which the soul had something to say that would have mattered, that was invited or occasioned by the circumstances, and that the soul chose to hold back. Those moments, the tablet says, are in the record, all of them, and the soul, at the gate, is asked to name them. The four categories of answer at the fourth gate follow the pattern of the second gate, but they are more difficult because the material is less accessible to the soul's own memory. The soul may not remember the refusals. It may have to reconstruct them, in the moment of the question, from what it knows about its own life. The four categories are these: the soul that names the significant refusals, in order, correctly; the soul that names some refusals, in some order, with some accuracy; the soul that names refusals that are not, in fact, the significant ones; and the soul that says it refused nothing. The mark of the whole hearing, which is given to the soul that names the significant refusals correctly, is described in the tablet as one of the rarest marks in the entire sequence. Most souls, the tablet says, cannot produce this answer. They do not, in life, keep track of the moments in which they chose not to speak. They keep track, if they keep track of anything, of the moments in which they did speak, and of the consequences of that speech. The moments of the withheld speech leave no external record. They have to be remembered by the soul alone, and the soul alone, in most cases, has not remembered them. To give the answer of the whole hearing is to have kept, during life, an internal record that few souls keep. And the mark, when it is given, is treated at the later gates as evidence that the soul had done a specific kind of self-observation that the tablet, in the priest's training, describes as one of the most difficult forms of moral attention. The mark of the partial hearing is the mark most souls receive at the fourth gate, if they receive any mark at all. It is the mark of the soul that, prompted, can name a few of its refusals, but that has forgotten most of them, and that names, when it names, the ones that were most visible at the time and that left, in the soul's own memory, some kind of trace. Regret does not, in the tablet's framing, cause the memory. The trace is left by something else, and the tablet does not, in the fourth gate section, specify what. The trace is what the soul, in the moment of the question, can access, and the soul that accesses some traces receives the partial mark. This mark is neutral at the later gates in the same way the partial mark at the second gate is neutral. It confers no advantage and no disadvantage. It records that the soul did what most souls do. The mark of the misplaced hearing is the fourth gate's equivalent of the mark of the mistaken reckoning at the second. It is given to the soul that names refusals that are not, in fact, the significant ones. The soul that dwells on small silences while overlooking large ones. The soul that treats the courtesies it withheld as more consequential than the truths it did not tell. The soul that has, in its life, developed a habit of paying attention to small refusals while remaining blind to larger ones. Endashrbanda does not, in giving this mark, treat the soul as immoral. He treats it as, in the tablet's phrasing, off the scale. The soul had a scale for measuring its own silences, and the scale was calibrated to the small end, and the large silences were invisible to it. The mark, at the later gates, functions as a caution, similar to the mark of the mistaken reckoning at the second gate. The soul that carries it is a soul whose measurements, in its own life, have been in some way miscalibrated, and the questioners at the later gates will listen for whether the miscalibration is still present in the soul's later answers. The soul that says it refused nothing is, at the fourth gate, in the same position as the soul at the second gate that said it owed nothing. It is held. Endashrbanda does not accept the answer. He waits. The wait, at this gate, is different from the wait at the second. It is not, in the tablet's phrasing, a wait for the soul to remember. It is a wait for the soul to listen. What the soul is being invited to listen to, in the tablet's careful phrasing, is the moments of the refused speech themselves, the moments replayed in a form the soul can hear. The tablet does not describe the mechanism. It does not say how the moments are replayed, or in what form the soul hears them. It says only that the hearing happens, and that most souls, when it happens, recognize the moments they had chosen to forget, and are able, then, to name them. The soul that recognizes and names is admitted with the mark of the partial hearing. The soul that hears and does not recognize, and continues to insist that it refused nothing, is held further. The tablet is direct that this second hold, at the fourth gate, is a hold that the soul may not, in every case, come out of. Some souls, the tablet says, when they hear the moments of their refused speech and do not recognize themselves in them, are souls that have become, in a way the tablet describes but does not fully explain, unable to hear themselves. They cannot recognize their own voices in the record. They cannot connect the moments to themselves. And they remain, at the threshold, in a condition of what the tablet calls the deafness to one's own life. The tablet says that this condition, if it persists, resolves into an immediate assignment to a condition of the underworld called the condition of the closed ear. The condition of the closed ear is not, in the tablet's ranking, the worst of the 7. But it is a condition that the tablet describes with an unusual level of specific detail, and the detail is that the soul in this condition is unable, thereafter, to hear anything spoken by anyone, ever. It is not silent. It hears the muffled sound of speech around it, but it cannot make out what is being said, and it does not know, in the tablet's phrasing, what it is being told about itself, ever again. The tablet, in the fourth gate section, spends more material on the condition of the closed ear than on any of the other conditions, except the condition of the false name at the first gate. The material is presented as a warning to the priests to make sure that the family of the dying understands, in advance, that the answer of refused nothing is not, in fact, a safe answer. It is not, in the tablet's phrasing, a modest answer, or a humble answer, or an answer that reflects a life of appropriate reticence. It is, in the tablet's specific naming, the answer that leads more frequently than any other single answer, at the fourth gate, to the second hold, and to the assignment to the closed ear. And the priests were required to be able to explain, in the days before the death, why. The reason, in the tablet's own framing, is that the soul that claims to have refused nothing is claiming something about itself that no living human being can honestly claim. Every human being, in every life, has refused, at some moment, to say something they could have said. The claim of refused nothing is not, in the tablet's framing, a description of the soul. It is a description of the soul's blindness to itself. And the blindness, at the fourth gate, is precisely the thing that Endashrbanda is testing for. To claim it is to demonstrate it. And to demonstrate it, at the gate, is to be at risk of being assigned to the condition that the demonstration announces. The priests, in their training, were required to spend more time on the fourth gate than on any of the gates that came before it, because the fourth gate was the gate at which they lost, in the tablet's phrasing, the most souls under their care. The families of the dying, when they were counseled by the priests, were told the questions and the answers and the marks and the conditions. But the fourth gate, in the priest's experience, was the gate at which the counsel most often failed to land. The dying, at the moment of the question, forgot what they had been told. They defaulted to the claim of refused nothing, either because they had not, in life, kept the internal record, or because they had been raised in a tradition that treated the claim as a virtue. And the priests would learn, from other sources, that the soul they had counseled had been held at the fourth gate, and had been assigned to the closed ear, and had passed from the position of a soul that had received good counsel into the position of a soul that could not, thereafter, hear anything at all. The tablet describes this as one of the recurring sorrows of the priesthood, and it describes it, in the material that has been marked in the private notes of the 20th century scholars, as one of the passages that most helps explain the tablet's overall project, as one of the reasons the theology of Kutha placed such heavy emphasis on the training of the priests, and on the counseling of the dying, and on the writing down of the sequence in a form that could be studied by the families themselves, before the death, so that the counsel would not, at the fourth gate, be lost. The soul that passes the fourth gate, with one of the 3 surviving marks, proceeds now to the fifth. The fifth questioner is a figure whose name is more widely attested than any of the questioners so far, and whose function, at the fifth gate, is one that the tablet describes with particular care. There is more that the tablet says about the fourth gate and about the specific category of refusals it counts, and it is worth reading through before we continue, because the material contains one of the passages that the 20th century scholars flagged as being of unusual specificity. The passage describes a subcategory of refused speech that Endashur tracks separately, and that carries, at the later gates, a distinctive weight of its own. The subcategory is what the tablet calls the withheld warning. The withheld warning is the specific category of refused speech, in which the soul, during its life, saw something coming that was going to harm another person, and had the ability, in the moment, to speak and chose not to. The tablet is direct that this category is not a category of prophecy. It does not require the soul to have known with certainty what was going to happen. It requires only that the soul had seen enough to know that harm was possible and had chosen to keep the information to itself. The tablet says that this specific form of refused speech is, in the accounting Endashur keeps, weighted more heavily than any other single form. It is not weighted more heavily because the soul was responsible for the harm. The soul was not, in most cases, the cause. It is weighted more heavily because the soul, in seeing what was possible and choosing not to speak, participated in the harm by silence, and the participation by silence, in the theology of Kutha, is a category that has its own name. The name, in the tablet's Sumerian, is difficult to render in modern languages without losing the specific weight the word carried. The most common translation, in the private notes of the 20th century scholars, is the shared crime. The second most common is the invisible participation. The third, which one of the scholars preferred in a note that has survived in a private archive, is the co-authorship by silence. All three translations point in the same direction. The soul that withheld the warning, in the tablet's framing, is not, itself, guilty of the harm that followed, but it is treated, in the underworld accounting, as having been present in the harm, in a specific way, and the presence is one of the things Endashur notes. The tablet says that the soul that is asked to name its refusals, at the fourth gate, must, if it receive the mark of the whole hearing or the mark of the partial hearing, name the withheld warning specifically. It is not permitted to fold them into the general category of the refused speech. It must, when it comes to them, mark them out separately and describe, for each one it can remember, what the soul had seen, what the soul had chosen not to say, and what, so far as the soul knew, had followed. This description is not, in the tablet's framing, a confession. It is not the making of a plea. It is an accounting. The soul is simply saying what happened, and Endashur, in receiving the accounting, marks the record accordingly. The soul that names its withheld warnings, correctly and specifically, receives a supplemental mark, in addition to whichever primary mark it received. The supplemental mark is called, in the tablet, the mark of the acknowledged participation. This is not, itself, a positive mark in the ordinary sense. It is a mark that says, about the soul, that the soul had, in its life, participated in harms it did not commit by not speaking, and that the soul, at the gate, had named the participations. The mark, at the later gates, is treated with care. It is not held against the soul in any of the later questions. It is, instead, treated as one of the marks that most heavily distinguishes the soul that has, in the tablet's phrasing, brought itself fully to the sequence from the soul that has brought only the parts of itself that are comfortable to see. The soul that carries this mark, in the priest's training, is a soul that has done, at the fourth gate, work that most souls at that gate are unable to do. And the questioners at the fifth and sixth and seventh gates, when they see this mark, treat the soul with a specific attentiveness that the tablet describes but does not attempt to name. The soul that does not name its withheld warnings, but that names other refusals, is not penalized. The tablet is careful to note this. The absence of the supplemental mark is not, in itself, a mark of any kind. It simply means that the soul, at the fourth gate, did not name the withheld warnings. This may be because the soul did not have any withheld warnings to name, which the tablet says is possible but rare. Or it may be because the soul had them but did not remember them, or did not recognize them as belonging to the category. Endashur, in these cases, does not press. He does not, at the fourth gate, provide the reminder in the way that Bitu at the third gate sometimes provides the naming. The withheld warnings, if they were not named, remain unnamed, and the soul proceeds, with its primary mark, to the fifth gate. There is, in the fourth gate section, one further observation that the tablet makes, and it is an observation that the priests were required to be able to describe to the family of the dying with unusual care. The observation is that the withheld warning, as a category, includes warnings that were withheld from the soul itself, the soul that saw, in its own life, evidence of a course of action that was going to bring harm to itself, and that chose not to warn itself in the sense of acting on the evidence, is treated as having withheld a warning. The tablet is careful about this. It does not mean that every self-destructive choice is a withheld warning against the self. It means, specifically, the moments in which the soul had clear evidence of what was coming, and had the ability to alter its course, and chose not to. Those moments, if they occurred, are in the record. And the soul, at the fourth gate, is expected to name them, alongside the warnings withheld from others, as a single category of refused speech that the soul, in its life, did not speak. The scholars in the 20th century were, in their notes, particularly interested in this extension of the category. Several of them noted that it changes, in a significant way, the meaning of the fourth gate. If the withheld warning includes the withheld warning to the self, then the fourth gate is not only a gate that tests the soul's relationships with others, it is also a gate that tests the soul's relationship with itself. The soul that chose, in its own life, not to say to itself what it had seen, is the soul that is being asked, at the fourth gate, to say it now, to name, at the gate, the warnings the soul withheld from itself during life, to say, in the moment of the question, what the soul saw and did not, in the living, allow itself to hear. This is, the scholars agreed, a difficult reading of the fourth gate, and a demanding one, and one that the priests, in their training, may or may not have taught in exactly this form, but it is a reading the tablet supports, in the specific wording of the extension, and it is a reading that, if it is correct, makes the fourth gate a gate of a particular kind of internal reckoning that is not present in any of the other six. We turn, now, to the fifth gate, the fifth questioner, the fifth question, and the specific way in which the fifth gate operates on the soul that has, by this point, passed through 4 separate examinations, and that carries, on the record, 4 separate marks, some of which are positive, some of which are neutral, and some of which are cautions, and all of which the fifth questioner will read in the moment of the fifth question before deciding how to press. The tablet, in the transitional lines between the fourth and fifth gates, adds one final passage about the fourth gate that is worth reading before we cross. The passage describes what the priests were trained to do in a specific case, and the case is one the priests, in the tablet's phrasing, encountered often. The case is the case of the dying soul that, in its counseling, was asked by the priest to prepare its list of refusals, and that, in the days before death, did the work of the preparation honestly and thoroughly, and that arrived at a list that was long and specific and painful to look at. The priest, in these cases, was required to sit with the soul and to receive the list and not to comment on it. The tablet is direct that the priest is not to absolve, and not to justify, and not to soften. The list is what the soul brings to the fourth gate, and the priest's role is to make sure that the list has been assembled, and that the soul can carry it into the moment of the question, without the list becoming something other than what it is. The tablet notes that this work of not commenting was, in the priest's own training, one of the most difficult things they were required to learn. It is easier, the tablet acknowledges, to comfort than to witness. It is easier to say that the refusals were understandable, or that the soul had done its best, or that the circumstances of the life had made the refusals inevitable. All of these responses, the tablet says, are compassionate in the ordinary sense, and all of them, at the fourth gate, are harmful. They interfere with the soul's ability to bring the list, unadorned, to Endashrbanda. They add, to what the soul is preparing to say, an overlay of interpretation that the soul may then, at the gate, produce instead of the list itself. And Endashrbanda, in the tablet's careful framing, does not want the interpretation. He wants the list. The priests were trained, therefore, to receive the list without interpreting it, and to encourage the dying to hold the list, in the days before death, as a list and not as anything else. The list, and the ability to speak it at the moment of the question, was what the priest was helping the soul to prepare, nothing more. This training, the tablet notes in the final lines of the fourth gate section, was the training that the priests of Kutha considered the most distinctive of their tradition. Other priesthoods, in the ancient world, offered comfort. Other priesthoods offered absolution. The Kutha priests, in their own understanding of their function, offered neither. They offered, in the tablet's phrasing, the receipt of the list, and the training of the soul to be able to speak the list, and the preparation of the family to understand why the receipt and the training were the whole of what the priests could do. The theology of Meslam, in this passage, is described as a theology of, specifically and only, the honest accounting. What the soul brought to the gates, brought honestly, was what the soul brought. And what happened to the soul after the gates was a function of what the soul had brought, and nothing else. The fifth gate. Its questioner is a figure named Igalima, and Igalima, unlike the two Kutha-specific questioners at the second and fourth gates, is attested widely across the surviving Sumerian and Akkadian material. He appears in the god lists as one of the sons of Ningirsu, and he holds, in the older mythology, the office of the doorkeeper of the god's temple. His role in the Kutha tablet is a specialized version of that older office. He is, at the fifth gate, the doorkeeper of the inner sequence. The first four gates, in the tablet's structural framing, are the outer gates. They test the soul on what the soul was and what the soul did in the outer, visible world. The fifth, sixth, and seventh gates are the inner gates. They test the soul on something else. And Igalima, standing at the boundary, is the figure whose function is to determine whether the soul, having passed the outer gates, is in a condition to be tested by the inner ones. The question Igalima asks is this: what was the last thing you saw that changed you? The question is not, the tablet is careful to note, about the most recent event before death. It is not about the deathbed itself. It is about the last moment, in the life, in which the soul saw something, and the seeing altered what the soul was. The question is about the final significant seeing. And significant, at the fifth gate, has a specific meaning. It means the seeing that produced, in the soul, a change that lasted, not a change that was noticed and forgotten, not a change that was felt and dissolved, a change that persisted in the soul, from the moment of the seeing to the moment of death. Igalima is asking, in effect, what did you last see that you carried with you until now? The four categories of answer at the fifth gate are structured differently again. The categories are these: the soul that names, correctly, the last thing it saw that changed it, and that describes the change. The soul that names something it saw that changed it, but not the last one. The soul that names something it saw that did not, in fact, change it. And the soul that says it saw nothing that changed it. The mark of the completed sight, which is given to the soul that names the last significant seeing correctly, is described in the tablet as one of the marks that most clearly identifies the soul as one of the exceptional cases. The reason, the tablet says, is that the ordinary soul, at the moment of death, has not, in life, been in the habit of keeping track of the moments of significant seeing. The moments occur, and they change the soul, and the change becomes part of who the soul is. But the moments themselves are not remembered as distinct events. They are absorbed. They become the background of the soul's life. And the soul, in the moment of the question, cannot separate them out from the general fabric of its experience. To be able to name the last one, correctly, is to have kept, during life, a particular kind of attention to one's own transformations. And the mark, when it is given, is treated at the sixth and seventh gates with the same weight as the mark of the whole reckoning at the second and the mark of the acknowledged line at the third. The mark of the earlier sight is the mark most commonly given at the fifth gate. It is the mark of the soul that names, when asked, a moment of significant seeing that was not, in fact, the last one, but that was an earlier one, and that the soul remembers because it was the most vivid or the most emotionally weighted. The tablet says that this is the ordinary answer. Souls remember the seeing that shook them, not the seeing that transformed them, and these are, in most lives, not the same. The seeing that shook the soul is the seeing that produced an immediate reaction that was intense in the moment, and that was afterwards told and retold, becoming, in the retelling, one of the soul's stories about itself. The seeing that transformed the soul is often quieter, less immediately visible, less easily narrated. It may have been a small seeing, a moment in a room, or on a road, or in a conversation, that the soul at the time did not mark as important, but that, in the days or years that followed, produced a change the soul is still carrying. Igalima, in the tablet's framing, is not asking about the vivid seeing. He is asking about the transforming one. And most souls, when they answer, produce the vivid instead. The mark of the earlier sight is Igalima's acknowledgement that the soul has answered the question the soul heard, rather than the question that was asked. It is a neutral mark. It admits the soul to the sixth gate. It confers no advantage and no disadvantage. It records that the soul, in the moment, produced the accessible memory rather than the accurate one. The mark of the false sight is the fifth gate's version of the marks of mistaken and misplaced attention at the earlier gates. It is given to the soul that names a seeing that did not, in fact, change it. This is different from the earlier sight, in a specific way. The earlier sight is a real transformation, remembered out of order. The false sight is a seeing that the soul, in the moment of the question, believes to have been transformative, but that, in the record Igalima keeps, was not. The tablet describes several categories of false sight, and the description is one of the sections that the 20th century scholars, in their private notes, treated with particular interest. The categories include the seeing that produced an intense emotional reaction that then dissolved, leaving no lasting change. The seeing that the soul afterwards told itself was transformative, without the transformation actually occurring. The seeing that changed the soul's stated beliefs, without changing anything else about the soul. And the seeing that changed the soul briefly, before some later event undid the change. Igalima, in his record, keeps track of these. And the soul that names one of them as its last transformative seeing is, in his framing, mistaken about its own transformations. The mark at the sixth and seventh gates functions as a caution. The soul, the questioners will note, has a habit of misidentifying which of its experiences changed it, and the questioners will listen, in the later answers, for whether the misidentification is still operating. The soul that says it saw nothing that changed it is, at the fifth gate, in a position that differs from the equivalent positions at the second and fourth gates. Igalima does not hold this soul at the threshold. He does not wait for reconsideration. He does not invite listening. Instead, he does something the tablet describes in a passage that the 20th century scholars marked with particular attention. He shows the soul what the soul had seen. The tablet does not describe the mechanism of the showing. It says only that the showing happens, and that it is not a replay of the seeing in the sense of a repetition of the original event. It is, in the tablet's phrasing, the presentation of the transformation itself. The soul is shown, in some form the tablet does not specify, what it had become as a result of a seeing, or of a sequence of seeings, that the soul had not, in life, connected to the transformation. And the soul, in seeing this, is asked to identify the seeing that had produced the transformation. If the soul identifies correctly, it is admitted with a mark that the tablet calls the mark of the belated sight. This mark is a mark that says, about the soul, that the soul had not, in life, seen its own transformation clearly, but that, at the gate, when shown, the soul had been able to identify the source. The mark is treated at the later gates as a version of the mark of the earlier sight, but with an additional note. The note is that the soul had, in life, allowed transformations to occur without noticing them. Whether this is a virtue or a fault, the tablet does not say. It notes only that the soul is a soul that has been changed by things it did not, at the time, know were changing it. The soul that, when shown, does not identify the source, is treated differently. The tablet says that Igalima, in these cases, provides one further prompt. He names, for the soul, the general category of the transformative event. He says, in the tablet's phrasing, it was something you heard, or it was something you saw, or it was something someone said to you. The category, and no more. If the soul, given the category, can then locate the specific event, it is admitted with the mark of the assisted sight, which is a further weighted version of the belated sight, with a further note that the soul required not only the showing of the transformation, but the naming of the category before it could locate the source. If the soul, even with the category, cannot locate the event, it is assigned to a condition the tablet names but does not fully describe, called the condition of the unregistered life. This condition is described, in the tablet's terse phrasing, as the condition of a soul that lived without noticing what it had become, and that arrives at the underworld unable to say what it had been changed by. The condition is not, in the tablet's ranking, the worst of the seven, but it is a condition that the priests were required to describe to the family of the dying with particular care, because the priests believed, and the tablet supports, that the condition was preventable, in life, by the simple habit of noticing one's own transformations as they occurred. There is more, in the fifth gate section, that the tablet says about the specific character of the transformative seeings that Igalima is asking about. The tablet is careful to note that the transformative seeing is not always a seeing of something extraordinary. It is not, in most cases, a seeing of a miracle, or of a great event, or of a figure of power. The transformative seeing, in the tablet's framing, is more often ordinary. It is the seeing of a small kindness that changed the soul's understanding of what was possible between people. It is the seeing of a small cruelty that changed the soul's understanding of what people could do without noticing. It is the seeing of an old person's face, in a specific moment, in a specific light, that showed the soul something about the passage of time that it had not before understood. These small seeings, the tablet says, are the most common source of the transformations Igalima keeps track of. And the soul that has, in life, developed the habit of attending to them is the soul that will most easily, at the fifth gate, produce the correct answer. The mark of the completed sight, then, is the mark of a soul that had, in life, attended to the small transformative seeings. The mark of the earlier sight is the mark of a soul that had attended, but to the more dramatic ones, the mark of the false sight is the mark of a soul that had attended to the wrong thing. The mark of the belated sight is the mark of a soul that had not attended at all, but that could, at the gate, recognize what had happened. The mark of the assisted sight is the mark of a soul that had not attended and could not recognize, but that could locate the source when given the category. The condition of the unregistered life is the condition of a soul that had not attended, could not recognize, and could not locate. These are the 6 possible outcomes of the fifth gate in the tablet's specific enumeration. And the soul, whichever of them it receives, proceeds now, if it proceeds, to the 6th. The 6th gate is the gate at which the inner sequence, in the priest's framing, becomes fully interior. The first 4 gates tested the soul on what the soul was and did. The 5th gate tested the soul on what the soul had noticed about its own transformations. The 6th gate tests the soul on something more specific, and the specific thing is one that the tablet describes with more care and more length than any of the questions that have come before it. Before we cross to the 6th gate, there is a section in the 5th gate material that is worth reading, because it addresses a specific extension of the 5th question that the priests treated as important. The extension is what the tablet calls the counter-transformation. The counter-transformation is what happens when a soul, in life, is transformed by a seeing, and then, at some later point, undertakes work to undo the transformation. The soul recognizes that it has been changed by an event, judges the change to have been in some way harmful, and works, over months or years, to return itself to what it had been before. The tablet is direct that this work, if it succeeds, is not counted, at the 5th gate, as a reversal that erases the transformation. The transformation happened, the soul was changed, and even if the soul later worked itself back toward what it had been, the seeing that produced the change is still in the record, and Igalima will still ask about it. The tablet says that this creates a specific difficulty for the soul at the 5th gate. The soul that has undertaken the counter-transformation may, in the moment of the question, believe that its last transformative seeing was the seeing that produced the change that was later undone. But Igalima, in his own accounting, may not agree. He may consider the work of the counter-transformation itself, over the months or years, to have been a transformation of its own, driven by a specific seeing or a specific sequence of seeings that occurred during the work. The last transformative seeing, in this framing, may not be the original event. It may be the moment, during the counter-transformation, at which the soul saw something that made the work possible or made it real. And the soul, if it names the original event without naming the later one, is naming an earlier seeing and receiving the mark of the earlier sight. The priests, in the tablet's material, were required to be able to counsel the dying on this specific difficulty. Souls that had undertaken major work of self-alteration during their lives were, the priests taught, at particular risk of misnaming their last transformative seeing at the 5th gate, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had done something that involved multiple seeings, some of which were more dramatic than the actual final transformation, and the dramatic ones were the ones the soul was likely to remember when asked. The counsel, in these cases, was to encourage the dying to think back not to the seeings that had produced the changes they had wanted to make, but to the seeings that had occurred during or after the work of change, and that had, in some quiet way, sealed it. Those, the priests taught, were the seeings Igalima was most often asking about in cases of souls that had done the counter-transformation work. And the soul that could name them, correctly, would receive the mark of the completed sight even where the earlier seeings had been more visible. This counsel, the tablet notes, was one of the counsels that the families of the dying most often found difficult to accept. The dramatic seeings were, in most cases, the ones the family knew about, and the ones that had been discussed openly during the life. The quiet seeings, at the end of the work of change, were often private, known only to the soul itself. The families, in counseling their dying members, would often prompt them to remember the visible transformations, and the priests, if they were doing their job, would redirect. They would ask the dying to think, instead, about the quiet moments, about the ordinary moments, in the ordinary settings, in which the change that had been worked for had, at some point, become permanent. Those were the moments the priests wanted the dying to bring to the fifth gate, and the training of the priests included specific techniques for helping the dying to locate them, without the priests themselves specifying what the moments had to look like. The tablet, in the closing lines of the fifth gate section, offers one further observation. The observation is that the transformative seeing, whatever it was, need not have been a seeing that the soul, at the time, understood as positive. Some transformations are, in themselves, difficult. A soul may be transformed by seeing something painful, or by witnessing a loss, or by understanding something about itself that the soul did not want to understand. These transformations, the tablet is direct, are counted in Igalima's record on the same basis as the transformations produced by pleasant seeings. The question is not whether the transformation was welcome. The question is whether it occurred and whether it persisted. The soul that was transformed by pain, and that carried the transformation with it into the moment of death, may be the soul that produces, at the fifth gate, the answer of the completed sight. And the answer, whatever the material of the transformation was, is what Igalima is listening for. The transformation itself, and the soul's ability to name it, is the mark of a life that had been lived with attention. Nothing else, at this gate, is being weighed. The transitional lines between the fifth and sixth gates, in the tablet's own text, are unusually short. Most of the transitional passages between gates include some material that anticipates the next question. The transition from the fifth to the sixth includes almost nothing. The tablet says, in a phrase that has been translated in several ways, that the sixth gate is the gate at which the soul begins to be spoken to about what it is. The phrasing suggests that the sixth question, unlike the first five, does not ask the soul about a specific feature of its life. It asks the soul about the soul itself, and the transition to the sixth is brief because there is nothing in the tablet's framing to anticipate. The sixth question, when the soul reaches it, will be about the soul, and the soul will hear it in a form the previous questions did not prepare the soul to hear. There is one more piece of the fifth gate material that the tablet includes, and that is worth reading before we cross, because it addresses a category of soul that the priests encountered in their counseling practice, more often than the general framing of the fifth gate might suggest. The category is the soul that had lived a life in which the transformations were external rather than internal. The soul that had been moved from place to place. The soul that had held many roles. The soul that had lived through wars or migrations, or the collapse and rebuilding of the community around it, and that had, in those events, been changed by the external circumstances rather than by any internal seeing. These souls, the tablet says, are common, and Igalima, in his accounting, treats them with a specific kind of care. The care takes the following form. Igalima, at the fifth gate, does not treat the external changes as the transformations he is asking about. The soul that was moved from one country to another was, in that moving, changed in many ways. Its language may have changed. Its work may have changed. Its habits may have changed. Its family situation may have changed. None of these, in Igalima's accounting, is what he is asking about. He is asking, still, about the seeing that changed the soul internally. And the soul that had many external changes may have had, in each of them, an internal transformation that occurred alongside, or that did not occur, or that occurred later, in a moment that was not directly caused by the external change but was made possible by it. Igalima, when he encounters souls of this category, asks the question in the same wording as he asks any other soul, but he listens, in the tablet's phrasing, for the internal event within the external one. He wants to hear, if the soul has been through a war, not the naming of the war, but the naming of the moment within the war, in which the soul saw something that changed what the soul was. The moment in the trench, the moment in the camp, the moment in the crowd. The specific moment that, within the general event, produced the specific internal transformation. Igalima, the tablet says, is patient with these souls, because he understands that they may not, in the moment of the question, immediately locate the internal event within the external one. And he gives them, in most cases, more time than he gives the ordinary soul to produce their answer. The tablet notes that the priests, in their counseling, were required to prepare souls of this category in a specific way. Souls that had lived through major external upheavals were to be counseled in the days before death, to think about the internal moments within the upheavals, to identify, if they could, the specific moment or moments in which the internal transformation had occurred, to be able to name these moments at the fifth gate in a form that Igalima would recognize as the answer he was asking for. The counseling, the tablet says, was often difficult because the souls in these cases had often, in life, told the story of the upheaval itself so many times that the internal moments had been overwritten by the external narrative. The priests were trained to help the souls to work back, past the narrative, to the moments themselves. And the training was one of the specialized branches of the priestly work at Kutha. Souls that had lived quiet lives, without major external upheavals, presented Igalima with a different challenge. In these cases, the internal transformations were often smaller and more subtle and more difficult to remember, because they had not been marked by any external event that the soul could use as an anchor. The priests, in counseling these souls, were required to help them locate the internal transformations in the ordinary fabric of the life. A conversation with a neighbor, an hour alone in the garden, a moment while walking home from the market. The transformations of these souls, the tablet says, were as real as the transformations of the souls that had lived through great events. They were simply harder to see. And the priests, in preparing the dying, were required to help them see the transformations without inflating them into events they had not been. This work, on both sides, was what the priests understood as the specialized labor of the fifth gate. And the tablet, in the final lines before it turns to the sixth gate, notes that the specialized labor was one of the reasons the priesthood at Kutha existed. Not because the theology could not have been transmitted without the priests, but because the specialized labor of preparing souls for the specific questions at the specific gates could not, in practice, be undertaken by anyone other than someone trained in the tradition. The priests, in this framing, were not intermediaries between the soul and the underworld. They were teachers. Their job was to prepare the soul to speak, at each of the 7 gates, in the way that would produce, at each gate, the fullest and most accurate answer the soul was capable of giving. And the fullest and most accurate answer was, in the theology of Kutha, the whole of what the soul could do to affect its own outcome. Nothing else, in the theology, was available to the soul at the moment of the question, and the priests, in their preparation, were doing the whole of what could be done. The scholars in the 20th century, in their private notes on the fifth gate section, spent considerable time on one particular aspect of Igalima's questioning that the tablet describes with unusual specificity. The aspect is the way in which Igalima weights, differently, the transformations produced by seeings that were sought out and the transformations produced by seeings that came unbidden. A soul that had, during its life, actively looked for the moments of transformation, that had traveled to see, that had asked to be told, that had put itself in front of the things it hoped would change it, is a soul that had, in the tablet's phrasing, worked at its own transformation. A soul that had, instead, been transformed by seeings that arrived without being sought, that had come, in the tablet's phrasing, in the middle of an ordinary day, is a soul that had been transformed by what the tablet calls the given seeings. Igalima, at the fifth gate, treats both categories with weight, but he weights them differently. The transformations produced by sought seeings are, in his accounting, weighted lower. Not because the soul had done something wrong in seeking them, but because the seeking itself, in the tablet's framing, is often driven by what the soul thought it wanted the transformation to be. The soul had a picture, in advance, of what it would become if it saw the thing. And the transformation, when it occurred, was often a version of that picture, and the soul's report of the transformation, at the fifth gate, is often a report of what the soul had wanted, rather than of what had actually happened. Igalima listens for this. He is not deceived by it. And the mark he confers on the soul that names, at the fifth gate, a sought transformation, is a mark that is slightly weighted with the note that the soul may have been reporting the intention rather than the outcome. The transformations produced by given seeings are weighted higher, in his accounting, because the soul had not, in advance, had a picture of what the transformation would be. The seeing came without warning. The change followed without the soul's plan. And the soul, when it reports the transformation at the fifth gate, is reporting what actually happened, because there was, in the case of the given seeing, nothing else for the soul to report. The mark, in these cases, is the standard mark, unweighted, and it carries the full value the tablet assigns. The The priests, in their counseling, were required to be able to distinguish, in the dying soul's account of its own life, between the sought and the given. And the distinction was, the tablet notes, one of the most difficult of the counselor's tasks. Souls in their final days often did not, themselves, remember which of their transformations had been sought and which had been given. The categories, from the soul's perspective, blended together. The priest's job was to help the soul separate them, so that the report at the fifth gate would be accurate. And the accuracy, the tablet says, was worth the difficulty of the counseling, because it was, at the fifth gate, one of the specific things Igalima was listening for. The sixth gate. Its questioner is a figure named Neti, and Neti, like Igalima at the fifth gate, is a figure attested widely in the surviving Sumerian material. In the Descent of Inanna, he is the chief doorkeeper, the figure who negotiates with the goddess at the outer wall and who reports back to Ereshkigal. In the Kutha tablet, his function is different. He is not the chief doorkeeper of the whole underworld. He is the questioner at the sixth gate, and his function, at that gate, is one that the tablet describes with the most care of any of the seven. The question Neti asks is this: what did you know about yourself that you did not tell? The question is, the tablet is direct, deliberately different from the fourth question. The fourth question, asked by Endashrbanda, was about the things the soul refused to say. The refusals could have been about many things. About others. About events. About what the soul saw. The sixth question is more specific. It is about the things the soul knew about itself, and did not, during its life, tell anyone. And the anyone, in Neti's question, includes, in a specific way, the soul itself. The tablet spends unusual time on the wording. The Sumerian word being translated as tell is a word that carries, in this context, the specific implication of allowing a piece of information to become known. It can mean telling another person. It can mean writing something down. It can mean saying something aloud, to no one, in a form that makes it real. And it can mean, in a usage the tablet emphasizes, allowing oneself to know something one already, in some sense, knew but had not, until the telling, allowed to become known to oneself. The question Neti asks, in this fuller sense, is about the things the soul knew about itself and did not allow to become known, either to others or to itself, during the life. This is, in the tablet's framing, the most difficult of the seven questions to answer accurately. The reason is not that the soul cannot know the answer. It is that the soul, if it has kept the information from itself for the duration of the life, may not be able to access it at the moment of the question in the form the question requires. The soul may have known the thing in some layer of its awareness, but may have kept the layer from the other layers, and the keeping may have become, over years or decades, so habitual that the soul, at the gate, cannot straightforwardly say what it knew about itself and did not tell. The tablet is direct that this is the ordinary condition. Most souls, at the sixth gate, arrive with a great deal of self-knowledge that they had not, in life, allowed to become known. And the sixth gate is the gate at which this material, if it is going to be brought into the soul's own accounting, has to be brought. The four categories of answer at the sixth gate are structured around what the soul can, at the moment of the question, produce. The categories are these: the soul that names the significant things it knew about itself and did not tell, and describes them, and the withholdings. The soul that names some things, with some accuracy. The soul that names things it knew but that were not, in fact, the significant ones. And the soul that says it knew nothing about itself that it had not told. The mark of the full self-hearing, which is given to the soul in the first category, is described in the tablet as the rarest of all the marks in the seven gates. Rarer than the correct answer at the first gate, which some souls at least approach through the practices the tablet hints at. Rarer than the mark of the whole reckoning at the second, which souls with disciplined moral attention can produce. Rarer than any of the heavy marks at the third, or the mark of the whole hearing at the fourth, or the mark of the completed sight at the fifth. The rarity, the tablet says, is not because the material is unavailable. The material is present in every soul. Every soul has known, during its life, things about itself that it did not tell. The rarity is because the accessing of the material, at the moment of the question, requires that the soul have done, during life, the specific work of allowing itself to know what it already knew. And this work, the tablet says, is not common. Most souls do not undertake it. Most souls, at the sixth gate, arrive with the material intact but sealed, and the seal is what Neti's question is testing. The mark of the partial self-hearing is the mark most commonly given at the sixth gate. It is the mark of the soul that, prompted by the question, produces some of what it had kept from itself, but not the fullness of what it had kept. The soul that names, at the gate, one or two of the things it had known about itself and not told. That describes them, briefly, in the moment. That acknowledges that there were probably more, that the soul could not, in the moment, remember them all. This mark, the tablet says, is a mark of a soul that had, in life, at least partly opened the seal on its own self-knowledge, and that had, at the gate, been able to bring some of the material into the open. It is not a heavy mark, but it is not, in the tablet's careful phrasing, a neutral one either. It is a mark that says, about the soul, that the soul had done, in life, at least the beginning of the work Nettie is asking about. And the mark, at the seventh gate, is treated with a specific attentiveness that the tablet describes but does not fully explain. The mark of the diverted self-hearing is the mark given to the soul that names things about itself that it had known, but that were not, in Nettie's own accounting, the significant ones. The soul that dwells on small self-knowledge while overlooking the large, the soul that talks about its habits while remaining silent about its convictions, the soul that, in producing its answer, produces material that is genuinely true about the soul, but that is not the material that had been the most important of what the soul had known and not told. Nettie, in giving this mark, is not accusing the soul of dishonesty. He is noting that the soul, when asked, produced the material that was easiest for the soul to produce, rather than the material that had been most difficult for the soul to keep sealed. The mark, at the seventh gate, functions as a caution. The soul, the questioner will note, has continued to divert, even at the gate, and the diversion is one of the patterns the seventh gate will be reading for. The soul that says it knew nothing about itself that it had not told is, at the sixth gate, in a position that the tablet describes with the most detail of any of the four categories at any of the seven gates. Nettie does not, in this case, hold the soul at the threshold in the way that Endashurima and Endashurbanda hold their respective failing souls. He does not wait for reconsideration. He does not invite a listening. Instead, he asks, in the tablet's phrasing, a follow-up question. The follow-up question is this: then who were you speaking to when you were alone? The follow-up question, the tablet is direct, is the moment at which the sixth gate becomes fully diagnostic. The soul that had, in life, spent time alone, and that had, in that time, spoken to itself, or to figures the soul imagined, or to the air, has, in that speaking, addressed a form of self that the soul had been aware of, at least in the moment of the speaking, and had been, in that awareness, communicating with. The soul is asked to identify who it was, in those moments, that was being spoken to. And the answer, whatever it is, tells Nettie what the soul had known about itself and not told. The tablet does not, in this passage, prescribe a correct answer. It describes several possible answers, and the treatment each receives. The soul that answers that it was speaking to itself, and that describes, in a way Nettie finds coherent, what that self was, is treated as having provided evidence that self-knowledge had been present during the life, in some form, and that the previous answer of knowing nothing had been, in a way the soul may not have fully understood, a claim about the concealment of what the soul knew, not about its absence. This soul is admitted, in the tablet's framing, with the mark of the delayed self-hearing, which is a version of the mark of the partial self-hearing, but with a note that says the delay had persisted through the primary question and had been overcome only by the follow-up. The mark, at the seventh gate, is treated as a version of the partial mark, without the additional attentiveness that the primary partial mark carries. The soul that answers that it was speaking to a figure the soul imagined, and that describes the figure, is treated with a specific form of interest. Nettie, in the tablet's phrasing, listens to the description of the imagined figure. He is listening for who the figure was, in relation to the soul. The soul may describe a figure that was a version of a parent, or a lost lover, or a teacher, or a friend, or a stranger the soul had once met and never forgotten. The figure, whoever it was, is treated by Nettie as a form the soul had used to speak to itself, and the form itself is information about what the soul was, and about what the soul had known about what the soul was. The mark given, in these cases, is the mark of the addressed self-hearing, and it is a mark that the tablet describes as neither positive nor negative, but as specifically informative. The soul is admitted, and the mark carries, into the seventh gate, information about the form the soul had used to know itself. The soul that answers that it was speaking to the air, or to no one, or that it had not, in fact, spoken to itself at all when alone, is treated in one of two ways. If Neti, in the tablet's phrasing, is satisfied that the soul is telling the truth, and that the soul had, in fact, lived a life in which the aloneness was silent, the soul is admitted with a mark called the mark of the silent aloneness. This mark is rare. It is not, in the tablet's framing, a mark that ordinary souls carry. It is the mark of souls that had lived in a specific relationship to themselves, in which the interior was not, during the aloneness, verbalized. The tablet describes this as a possible way of being, and does not judge it. The mark, at the seventh gate, is treated with a specific care that the tablet does not fully explain. If Neti, on the other hand, is not satisfied, and believes that the soul is still, at the sixth gate, concealing what it had known, the soul is assigned to a condition the tablet calls, in a phrase that has been translated in several ways, the condition of the sealed room. This condition is described, in the tablet's terse phrasing, as the condition of a soul that had, during its life, kept itself sealed from itself, and that arrives at the underworld in the same sealed condition, and that remains, in that condition, thereafter. The condition of the sealed room is, in the tablet's ranking, one of the more difficult of the seven fates. It is not the worst. The condition of the false name at the first gate is described as worse. But the condition of the sealed room is, in the tablet's phrasing, a condition of specific and continuing isolation from oneself, and the tablet notes that the isolation, once assigned, is not, in the theology of Kutha, something the soul can undo. The seal is the seal the soul made in life. The condition preserves it, and the soul, thereafter, remains sealed from what it had been. The scholars in the 20th century, in their private notes on the sixth gate section, were, in aggregate, more troubled by this section than by any of the others. Several of them wrote, in their notes, that the sixth gate was the gate at which the tablet's theology diverged most sharply from the theologies of the surrounding cultures. Most ancient theologies, the scholars observed, did not require the soul to know itself. Most ancient theologies did not treat the concealment of self-knowledge as a category the underworld would test. The sixth gate does. And the sixth gate does so with a specificity that suggests, the scholars agreed, that the Kutha priesthood had developed, in its own theology, an unusual attention to the interior life of the person, and had built into its account of the afterlife a specific test for whether that interior life had, during the person's actual life, been attended to. One of the scholars, in a note that survives only in a photograph of a page from his working copy, wrote that the sixth gate was, in his judgment, the reason the tablet had been held. Not because of anything the tablet said about the underworld, not because of the questions themselves, but because of the specific implication that the ordinary human life, unexamined, produces a soul that arrives at the sixth gate, sealed from itself, and that receives, on the basis of that sealing, one of the more difficult of the seven fates. The implication, the scholar wrote, is that the ordinary human life is not, in the theology of Kutha, sufficient. Something more is required. And the more that is required is the specific work of allowing oneself to know what one already knows about oneself. That work, the scholar wrote, is one the museum, and the culture the museum belongs to, would prefer not to have described in this form to the general public. Whether or not that is correct, the tablet says what it says, and the sixth gate operates as it operates, and the soul that passes it, with whichever mark it received, proceeds now to the seventh, which is the last of the gates, and the one that the tablet, in its final passages, describes with the specific care that its position in the sequence requires. There is more in the sixth gate section, and it is worth reading, because it contains a specific extension of Neti's questioning that the priests treated as one of the most important pieces of the tablet's material. The extension is what happens when the soul, having been asked the primary question, and having produced some form of answer, is asked by Neti a further clarifying question. The clarifying question is asked only in some cases, and the tablet does not specify precisely which cases, but the examples it gives suggest that it is asked when the soul's initial answer has been coherent but incomplete, and Neti believes there is more the soul knows about itself that has not yet been said. The clarifying question is this: what did you know about yourself that you told only to one other person? The specificity of the question, the tablet is direct, is intentional. It is not asking about the things the soul told to many people. It is not asking about the things the soul kept entirely to itself. It is asking about the specific category of self-knowledge that the soul had shared in life with exactly one other being, the friend the soul told a secret to, the lover the soul confided in, the parent, or child, or teacher, to whom the soul revealed something about itself that the soul revealed to no one else. That category of shared self-knowledge, the tablet says, is one that Neti keeps a separate record of. And the soul that had, in life, made such disclosures, and had kept them limited to the one other person, is a soul that has, in Neti's accounting, participated in a specific form of relationship that the tablet treats as significant. The soul that names, at the follow-up, the person or persons to whom it made these disclosures, and that describes the disclosures, receives a further supplemental mark called the mark of the shared knowing. This mark is not a mark of distinction in the way the mark of the acknowledge line at the third gate is a mark of distinction. It is a mark of connection. It says, about the soul, that the soul had, in its life, at least once, admitted another being into a piece of its self-knowledge that it had otherwise kept private. And the mark, at the seventh gate, is treated as evidence that the soul had, in its life, done something specific about the sealing that the sixth gate is otherwise testing for. The soul had, at least in one case, allowed the seal to be, in a limited way, opened, and the opening, the tablet says, is treated as significant. The tablet notes that the mark of the shared knowing is a mark that many souls, at the sixth gate, can receive, if they are willing, at the follow-up question, to name the person or persons and to describe the disclosures. The description does not have to be complete. It does not have to include the full content of what was shared. It only has to be honest about the fact of the sharing, and specific enough that Neti can locate the disclosure in his record. The soul that provides this level of honesty and specificity, in the moment of the follow-up, receives the mark. And the mark is one of the reasons the priests, in their counseling, urge the dying to think, in the days before death, about the moments of disclosure they had made, in their lives, to specific other beings, and to be prepared to name those moments at the sixth gate if Neti asked. The scholars in the 20th century, in their notes on this extension, spent particular time on the category of the disclosure that the soul had made to a being that was not, in the ordinary sense, another human person. The tablet, in the material immediately following the description of the mark of the shared knowing, notes that the disclosure category includes disclosures made to beings other than human beings. Specifically, the tablet mentions disclosures made to gods, disclosures made to the dead, and disclosures made to figures the soul had, in its life, believed to be present as witnesses to what the soul was doing. These disclosures, the tablet says, are counted in Neti's record on the same basis as disclosures to living human beings. The soul that had, in its life, made disclosures of self-knowledge to any of these figures, and that names them at the follow-up, receives the mark of the shared knowing on the same terms. This extension, the scholars agreed, is one of the passages that most clearly identifies the Kutha theology as a theology of what one of the scholars called, in a note that survives in a private collection, the porous interior. The soul, in this theology, is not sealed by default. It has, at every point in its life, the possibility of communicating what it knows about itself to a range of beings that includes but is not limited to other human persons. And the communications, in the tablet's framing, are what open the seal that the sixth gate would otherwise catch. A single disclosure, to a single figure, is enough to establish that the soul had, in some way, participated in the opening. And the mark, at the sixth gate, records the participation, the soul that had made no such disclosures, and that names none at the follow-up, and that is asked, then, the further question about the aloneness is the soul that is at the greatest risk, at the sixth gate, of the condition of the sealed room. The tablet is direct that the priests, in their counseling, considered this soul to be the soul most in need of the priest's specific attention. The counseling, in these cases, was designed to help the soul, in the days before death, to make at least one such disclosure, to at least one being, in a form that would establish the participation. The being did not have to be a human being. The disclosure did not have to be extensive. What mattered, the priest taught, was that the participation occur, at least once, in a form the soul itself could remember and describe. That participation, made in the final days, was still counted, and the soul, at the sixth gate, could name it and receive the mark, and pass through with the mark of the shared knowing, even where the soul had lived a whole life to that point without making any such disclosure to anyone. This council, the tablet notes, was one of the councils that most distinguished the Kutha priesthood from the other priesthoods of the ancient Mesopotamian world. Other priesthoods, in the days before death, offered prayers, or sacrifices, or ritual purifications. The Kutha priests offered, among other things, the specific opportunity to make a disclosure of self-knowledge to the priest himself, in a form that would establish the participation. The disclosures made in these deathbed sessions were, the tablet says, not shared with any other party. They were held by the priest, and taken by the priest into the underworld with the priest when the priest, in turn, died. And the soul that had made the disclosure, at the sixth gate, could name the priest, and describe the disclosure in terms the soul chose, and receive the mark of the shared knowing on the same terms as any other soul. The tablet, in the closing lines of the sixth gate section, offers one final observation about the mark of the shared knowing. The observation is that the mark, unlike most of the marks in the seven gates, is a mark that can be, in some sense, prepared for, even by a soul that has lived a life without any prior work of self-knowledge. The soul that has not, in life, done the work of allowing itself to know what it already knew, can still, in the final days, make a single disclosure to a single being, and can bring the memory of that disclosure to the sixth gate. The mark is not, in this case, weighted lower than the mark received by a soul that made many such disclosures over a lifetime. It is the same mark. The tablet is direct about this. And the reason, the tablet says, is that the mark is not a mark of the quantity or duration of the participation. It is a mark of whether the participation occurred at all. A single disclosure, made once, in the final days, is participation, and the soul that made it is a soul that had opened, at least once, the seal that the sixth gate is testing. The scholars in the 20th century, in their notes on this closing observation, treated it as one of the tablet's most surprising features. The theology of Kutha, as described in the sixth gate section, appears to be, in most of its emphases, a theology of long practice. The correct answer at the first gate requires knowledge that most souls do not, in their lives, acquire. The mark of the whole reckoning at the second gate requires a lifetime of moral attention. The heavy marks at the third gate require the specific work of engaging with one's inheritance, and so on. But the mark of the shared knowing at the sixth gate is, in the closing observation, described as accessible even to a soul that had done none of the other work. A single disclosure, made in the final days, is enough. And the tablet, in this observation, is describing a theology in which the sixth gate offers, specifically and only at this gate, a form of opening that does not require any prior discipline. The opening is available. It is available to any soul that will make one disclosure to one being before the moment of death, and the mark received is the same mark received by souls who had done the work all their lives. Why the sixth gate offers this opening, and why none of the other gates offer anything comparable, is a question the tablet does not answer. The scholars in the 20th century speculated. Some believed the opening was a mercy specifically directed at the sixth gate because the sixth gate's demands were, in the tablet's own framing, the most difficult to meet by ordinary means. Others believed the opening reflected a specific historical development in the Kutha theology, in which the priests had come to understand that the sixth gate's material was, in most souls, so deeply sealed that some form of accessible opening had to be provided, or the vast majority of souls would fail at that gate. One scholar suggested that the opening had been added to the tablet at some later point by priests who had determined, from long practice, that the sixth gate was producing too many assignments to the condition of the sealed room, and who had introduced the mark of the shared knowing as a way of reducing the number. Whichever explanation is correct, and the tablet does not settle it, the opening exists in the text, and the priests were trained to use it, and the families of the dying were told, in their preparation, that the opening was available. The single disclosure, made once, to any being, in the final days, is enough. The tablet is direct, and the soul that makes it, and that names it at the sixth gate, passes through with the mark, and proceeds now to the seventh, which is the last of the gates, and which asks the question the tablet describes with the most careful and most extensive material of any of the seven. The seventh gate. Its questioner is a figure whose name, in the tablet's own text, is written in a way that has been the subject of scholarly dispute since the tablet was translated. The name, in the Sumerian, is a compound of two signs, and the second sign is one that has been read, in different scholarly traditions, in several different ways. The most common reading, and the one the assistant curator in 1920 used, is Namtar. Namtar is a widely attested figure in the surviving Sumerian material. A functionary of the underworld, the deliverer of fates, the figure who carries the assignments from the throne of Ereshkigal to the souls that are to receive them. In the Descent of Inanna, he is present as one of the figures at Ereshkigal's court. In several other underworld texts, he is described as the executor of the queen's decisions. His name, in its ordinary etymology, means the one who cuts the fate, and the cutting is understood to be the moment at which the assignment becomes irrevocable. If the reading is Namtar, the seventh questioner is the figure who carries out the assignments the previous 6 gates have prepared, and his function at the 7th gate is to complete the sorting. The second reading, favored by some of the 20th century scholars, is more difficult to render. The second sign, in this reading, is not the sign that spells Namtar, but a similar sign that spells a different word, one that means, in the tablets period, the one who names. If this reading is correct, the seventh questioner is not Namtar. He is a different figure, one whose name is not attested in the other surviving material, and whose function, at the 7th gate, is not to cut the fate but to name what the soul has become. The two readings, the scholars noted, produce different theologies at the 7th gate. In the Namtar reading, the gate is the point at which the sorting is completed. In the alternative reading, the gate is the point at which the soul is told, in words, what it now is. The tablet does not resolve the reading. The sign is genuinely ambiguous, and the priests, in the material that survives from their training, appear to have taught both readings, treating them as complementary rather than contradictory. The 7th questioner, in the priest's framing, both completes the sorting and names what the soul has become. The two actions, in the theology of Kutha, may be the same action. The naming is the sorting, and the sorting is completed at the moment the name is given. Whatever the reading, the questioner at the 7th gate is the figure who does both. The question the 7th questioner asks is this: what will you say when I tell you what you are? The question, the tablet is careful to note, is not the same as any of the previous questions. It is not asking the soul to report something about the life. It is not asking the soul to name a category of experience. It is asking the soul, in advance, what the soul will say when the questioner tells the soul what the soul is. The question is perspective. It is asking the soul to describe, in advance, its response to a statement the questioner has not yet made. And the response, whatever it is what the 7th gate is testing. The tablet notes that the question is difficult to answer and difficult to prepare for, precisely because the soul does not know what the questioner is going to say. The statement the questioner will make is, in the tablet's phrasing, drawn from everything the previous 6 gates have established: the name, the debts, the inheritance, the refusals, the transformations, the self-knowledge. All of these have contributed to a description that the 7th questioner now has in front of him, and the description is what he is about to speak to the soul. The soul does not know, in advance, what the description will be. The soul knows only that the description is being drawn from what the soul, at the previous 6 gates, has said, and from what the record already contained. And the soul is being asked, before the description is spoken, to say what its response to it will be. The 4 categories of response at the 7th gate are structured around what the soul is willing to say, in advance, about the response it will give. The categories are these: the soul that says it will accept the description, whatever it is; the soul that says it will accept the description if the description is accurate, and will contest it if it is not; the soul that says it will contest the description, whatever it is; and the soul that says it does not know what it will say. The mark of the accepted naming, which is given to the soul in the first category, is the mark that the tablet describes with the most explicit interest of any of the marks in the 7 gates. The soul that says, at the 7th gate, that it will accept the description, whatever it is a soul that has, in the tablet's phrasing, brought itself fully to the sequence. It has arrived, after 6 gates, at a position in which it is willing to hear what it is without needing to negotiate the hearing. This position, the tablet says, is the position the theology of Kutha considers the endpoint of the whole preparation. It is the position of the one who has come to the gate without a picture of itself that it needs to protect. And the mark given to this soul is not, itself, the 7th mark. The 7th mark is given only after the description is spoken and the soul has responded to it. The mark of the accepted naming is a preliminary mark, given at the moment the soul commits to accepting, before the acceptance is tested by the actual description. The mark of the conditional acceptance, given to the soul in the 2nd category, is a more common mark, and it is the mark that the priests, in their counseling, most often prepared the dying to receive. The soul that says it will accept an accurate description and contest an inaccurate one is, in the tablet's framing, a soul that is willing to hear itself but that reserves the right to correct the hearing if the correction is warranted. This position, the tablet says, is a reasonable position, and it is not, in itself, a failure of the seventh gate. But it carries with it a specific requirement. The soul, when the description is spoken, must be able to tell, correctly, whether the description is accurate or not. And the ability to tell, correctly, is what the seventh questioner is now testing. If the description is accurate and the soul contests it, the soul has failed the test in one way. If the description is inaccurate and the soul accepts it, the soul has failed the test in another way. The mark, at the seventh gate, is given only after the description is spoken and the soul's response is measured against what the description actually was. The mark of the contested naming, given to the soul in the third category, is the mark of a soul that has decided, in advance, not to accept whatever the description is. The tablet describes this position with a specific care. It notes that the position may reflect several different underlying conditions. The soul may have brought to the seventh gate a picture of itself that it is unwilling to let go of, and the picture may be preventing the acceptance. The soul may have determined, on the basis of the earlier gates, that the description the seventh questioner is going to give is likely to be one the soul disagrees with. The soul may be, in the tablet's phrasing, simply unwilling to be named by another being, whatever the naming is. Each of these underlying conditions produces the same categorical answer, and the seventh questioner, in the tablet's framing, does not distinguish between them at the moment of the response. He notes the response, and he prepares to speak the description, and he waits. The soul that says it does not know what it will say is treated by the seventh questioner in a way that the tablet describes as generous. The seventh questioner, unlike the questioners at the earlier gates, does not treat the answer of not knowing as an answer that has to be held or corrected. He treats it as an honest answer, and he notes it, and he proceeds. The description is spoken, and the soul, having said it did not know what it would say, is then in a position to say something, and what it says is what the seventh gate will use to measure the response. The tablet, in the passage that follows the description of the four categories, spends unusual time on what happens when the description is spoken. The description, the tablet says, is not a description in the ordinary sense. It is not a summary of the life. It is not a list of the marks the soul has accumulated at the earlier gates. It is, in the tablet's phrasing, a single statement, spoken by the questioner, about what the soul now is. The statement is short, it is specific, and it is, in every case, drawn from the accumulated material of the 6 earlier gates, but is not, itself, that material. It is what the material adds up to. It is what the soul, at the end of the sequence, is. The tablet does not, in any of its surviving passages, give an example of what one of these statements looks like. It says that the statements vary from soul to soul, and that no two statements are the same. It says that the statements are not, in every case, negative, and that they are not, in every case, positive. They are, in the tablet's phrasing, simply what they are. And the soul, hearing the statement, is now in the position of having to give a response. The response, whatever it is what the seventh gate is measuring. And the measurement, in the tablet's careful framing, is not a measurement of whether the response is correct in any external sense. The measurement is whether the response is, in the tablet's phrasing, the response of the same soul that has passed through the 6 earlier gates. The seventh questioner is checking, in effect, that the soul has not changed, in the moment of hearing the description, into a soul other than the one that arrived at the gate. The soul may accept, or contest, or agree with parts and disagree with others, or say nothing at all, and any of these responses may be, at the 7th gate, the correct response. If it is the response the soul that has come through the 6 earlier gates would actually give. What the 7th gate is testing is the coherence between the soul that came through the 6 gates and the soul that responds, now, to hearing what it is. The 4 possible responses to the description and the 4 possible marks at the 7th gate are these. The response of the recognized self, which is the response of the soul that hears the description and, in whatever form of response it gives a response that is coherent with what the 6 earlier gates established. This response receives the mark of the whole soul. It is the 7th and final mark, and it is the mark that opens onto the position the tablet, in its final broken lines, tries to describe. The response of the divided self, which is the response of the soul that gives, in response to the description, an answer that is not coherent with what the earlier gates established. But that is coherent in some other way, and that reflects a soul that has, in the moment of hearing the description, shifted into a different form. This response receives a mark called the mark of the split, and the mark is one of the 7 conditions the tablet enumerates. The condition of the split is described, in the tablet's own phrasing, as the condition of a soul that arrived at the 7th gate as one being and left it as 2, and that carries, thereafter, an internal division that the earlier gates had not detected. The response of the refused self, which is the response of the soul that refuses to give any response at all, in a form that the 7th questioner recognizes as a refusal rather than as the honest answer of not knowing. This response receives an assignment to a condition called the condition of the closed reply, and the condition is described as the condition of a soul that heard what it was and refused to respond, and remains, thereafter, in a state of refusal that the underworld cannot penetrate. And the 4th response, the response the tablet spends the most time on, and that is, in every scholar's private notes, the response that the museum's hold instruction seems to have been most concerned about. The 4th response is the response of what the tablet calls the answering self. This is the response of a soul that, having heard the description, gives back to the questioner a response that is not, in any of the ordinary categories, an acceptance, a contestation, or a refusal. It is a response that is, in the tablet's phrasing, from the soul to the questioner as one being to another, on a subject the 2 of them now share. The soul does not accept the description. The soul does not contest it. The soul does not refuse to answer. The soul, instead, replies, and the reply is a reply that treats the description as a piece of information the soul is now receiving from the questioner, and that the soul is now, in the response, giving back its own view of. The tablet describes this response as extremely rare. The scholars in the 20th century agreed. Most souls, in most cases, do not produce this response. They produce one of the other 3, and they receive the corresponding mark. The response of the answering self requires that the soul, at the moment of hearing the description, be in a specific condition. The condition is that the soul has, through the 6 earlier gates, arrived at a position in which it is present to the questioner as a being that can and does speak, not as a being that is being sorted, not as a being that is being told, as a being that is, in the moment of the 7th gate, in conversation with the questioner about what the soul is. The condition, the tablet says, is one that the soul either has at that moment or does not have, and that the soul cannot, at that moment, produce if the earlier gates have not established the standing that makes it possible. The mark of the answering self, given to a soul that produces this response, is the 7th mark of the tablet, and it is different from the mark of the whole soul. The mark of the whole soul is the mark of coherence. The mark of the answering self is the mark of what the tablet calls, in a phrase that has been translated in several ways, the shared standing. The 2 marks are related but distinct. A soul may receive the mark of the whole soul without receiving the mark of the answering self. The reverse is also possible, though rarer. A soul that receives both marks, in the same response, is a soul that has, in the tablet's own phrasing, arrived at the 7th gate as itself, and has, in the moment of hearing what it is, spoken back, as itself, to the questioner. The position of the one who was not stopped, which is the tablet's name for the outcome that the 7th gate assigns to the soul that has passed all 7 and received the mark of the whole soul, is described, in the final passages of the tablet, in language that has been the subject of more scholarly commentary than any other section. The tablet says that the position is the position of a soul that has, through the 7 gates, been established as itself, and that continues, thereafter, as itself, without being sorted into any of the conditions the earlier gates could have assigned. It is not, in the tablet's phrasing, a position of reward. It is not a position of pleasure. It is not a position that resembles the paradises described in some of the later underworld literatures. It is, in the tablet's specific naming, a position of the continued being of the soul that came through, as the soul that came through, in the specific form it had established through the 7 gates. The tablet says, in a passage that has been translated in several ways, that the position of the one who was not stopped is a position of ongoing engagement with the underworld, on terms the soul had, at the 7th gate, established. The soul, in this position, is not a passive recipient of the underworld's conditions. It is an active participant in what the underworld is now, given that the soul has arrived and has been established as itself. The tablet describes this participation in specific but limited terms. The soul, in the position, is said to be able to speak to the other beings of the underworld, including the questioners at the seven gates, on terms of the shared standing that the mark of the answering self conferred. The soul is said to be able to move, within limits the tablet does not fully specify, in the geography of the underworld. The soul is said to be, in the tablet's phrasing, one of those who is present to what happens in the underworld, rather than one of those to whom the underworld happens. The scholars in the 20th century, in their notes on this section, spent considerable time trying to determine what the tablet was actually describing. Some believed the tablet was describing a form of the afterlife that resembled, in certain respects, the descriptions given in some of the later mystery religions of the ancient Mediterranean, in which the initiate, having passed through the specified ordeals, achieved a status of ongoing participation in the divine order. Others believed the tablet was describing something more specific to the Kutha theology, and less familiar from other sources. One scholar, in a note that survives only in a photograph of a page from his working copy, wrote that the position of the one who was not stopped appeared, on his reading, to be a position of continued existence as a specific kind of being, and that the being was something between what the ancient Mesopotamians would have called a god and what they would have called a person. The soul, in this reading, becomes, in the position of the one who was not stopped, a being with a specific and limited form of the standing that the gods had, and that the priests of Kutha understood to be the standing that the seven gates, if the soul passed them all, could confer. This reading, the scholar noted, would explain several features of the tablet that are otherwise difficult to explain. It would explain why the position is described as extremely rare. It would explain why the priests took the training so seriously. It would explain why the theology is described, in the fragments of later commentary, as a theology that promised something the other Mesopotamian theologies did not promise. And it would explain, the scholar noted, why the museum, in the specific historical moment in which it received the tablet, might have preferred not to add to the general public conversation a description of an ancient Mesopotamian theology that promised, to the soul that could pass its seven tests, a specific and named form of participation in the divine order. Whether or not that explanation is correct, the tablet says what it says, and the position of the one who was not stopped is described, in its final passages, in language that supports the scholar's reading, at least in general outline. The tablet, in what appears to be the last complete passage before the cracks that render the final lines unreadable, offers one further observation. The observation is that the position of the one who was not stopped is a position that has been reached, in the history of the Kutha priesthood, by a specific number of souls, and the number is small enough that the priests were able to count it. The tablet does not give the number. It says only that the number is known to the priesthood, and that the priesthood keeps the record. The souls who have reached the position, the tablet says, are the souls whose names the priesthood remembers. Not the names given to them by their parents, not the names given to them at the first gate, the names given to them at the seventh gate, when the questioner spoke the description, and the soul, in its response, was established as itself. Those names, the tablet says, are the names the priests keep. And those names, the tablet says, are the names by which the souls, in the position, are known to each other, and to the beings of the underworld, and to the priests of Kutha who continue, at Meslam, to teach the seven gates. The final broken lines of the tablet, before the cracks make the reading impossible, appear to describe how the priests learned the names, and how the names were transmitted, and how the count was maintained. The reading is difficult, and the assistant curator in 1920 was able to render only fragments. The fragments say, in the pieces that are legible, something about a mechanism by which the priests, at Meslam, could be told, by the souls, in the position of the one who was not stopped, of new arrivals. Something about a way in which the count could be updated. Something about a specific ritual, performed at the temple, in which the current priests would receive the names of any new souls that had, since the last performance, joined the position. And then the tablet breaks. The final lines, if they said anything more, are lost. What survives is the description of the position, the observation about the counting, and the fragments that suggest the priesthood believed itself to be in some ongoing form of communication with the souls that had, through the seven gates, reached it. The scholars in the 20th century, in their notes on the final broken lines, were, in aggregate, more careful in their commentary than in any of the other sections. The fragments, they agreed, describe a claim that is more specific and more consequential than any of the claims in the rest of the tablet. The claim is that the priesthood was, in its own understanding of itself, not only a body of teachers preparing the dying for the seven gates, it was also a body of receivers, of information from the souls who had passed the seven gates and reached the position of the one who was not stopped. The information, in the fragment's description, was received in a form the tablet does not specify. The count was maintained, the names were kept, and the priesthood, in its own view, was in ongoing contact with the small number of souls that had achieved, in the theology of Cutha, the outcome the theology existed to describe and to make possible. Whether the ongoing contact was real, in any sense that could be independently established, is a question the tablet does not address, and the scholars did not, in their notes, try to resolve. The tablet says what it says. The priests believe what they believed. And the fragments, before they break, describe a specific and coherent theological claim, which is that the seven gates were not a one-way passage, and that the position of the one who was not stopped was not, in the priest's understanding, a position of isolation from the world the soul had left. It was, in the tablet's own framing, a position of continued communication with the temple that had taught the sequence, through mechanisms the priests knew and practiced, and through a specific ritual whose description, in the tablet, breaks off before the description is complete. That is what the tablet says about the seventh gate, and about the position of the one who was not stopped, and about the priesthood's own claim to be in continued contact with the souls that had, over the generations, reached the position. It is where the tablet ends, in its readable portion, and it is where the description of the seven gates, in the specific form the Cutha priesthood taught them, ends. There is one further passage from the seventh gate section that is worth reading before we move to the synthesis, and it is a passage that most modern discussions of the tablet leave out. The passage describes what the priests told the family of the dying about the seventh gate specifically in the days before the death. The counsel, the tablet says, was different from the counsel given at the earlier gates in one important respect. At the earlier gates, the counsel had been about preparation. The soul was to be helped to prepare, in advance, for the questions it would be asked, so that it could give the fullest and most accurate answer possible. At the seventh gate, the counsel was not about preparation. It was about, in the tablet's specific phrasing, the willingness to be surprised. The priests, at the seventh gate, could not prepare the dying for the description that would be spoken. They did not know what the description would be. They knew only that the description would be drawn from what had been established at the earlier gates, and that the soul, in its response, would need to respond as the soul it had established itself as being. The counsel, therefore, was not a counsel about what to say. It was a counsel about how to receive. The dying was told, in the tablet's careful phrasing, that at the seventh gate the questioner would speak, and that what would be spoken would be, in some form, the truth of what the soul had become through the 6 earlier gates, and that the soul's task, at that moment, would be to receive the truth without needing to prepare for it in advance. This counsel, the tablet notes, was one of the counsels the priests found most difficult to give effectively, because the dying, in the days before death, wanted to prepare. They wanted to know what would be said. They wanted to rehearse their responses. And the priests were required to explain, patiently and repeatedly, that no preparation was possible, and that the attempt to prepare would itself, at the seventh gate, become a form of resistance to the description that could interfere with the response. The soul that arrived at the seventh gate with a rehearsed response was, in the tablet's phrasing, a soul that would produce the rehearsed response even if the rehearsed response was not, in the moment, the response the soul would have given had it not rehearsed. And the seventh questioner would note the rehearsal and would weigh the response accordingly. The counsel, therefore, was a counsel of, specifically, the receptive readiness. The dying was to be helped to arrive at the seventh gate in a state in which the response, when it was given, would come from the soul as it was at that moment, rather than from a rehearsal the soul had prepared in advance. The priests, in helping the dying arrive at this state, used a specific set of techniques, which the tablet describes in general terms. The techniques included, the tablet says, the practice of releasing, in the days before death, the pictures the soul had of itself, so that at the seventh gate the soul would be able to hear the description without measuring it against the pictures. The techniques included the practice of, in the tablet's phrasing, listening for what one is being told rather than for what one wanted to be told. The techniques included the practice of allowing surprise, so that at the seventh gate the surprise, when it came, would not be resisted. These techniques, the tablet notes, were among the specialized labors of the priesthood. They were the labors that most distinguished the Kutha priests from the priests of other traditions. And they were the labors that the tablet, in its final complete section before the fragments, identifies as the labors that made the sequence workable for souls other than the priests themselves. Without the council, the tablet says, most souls would fail the seventh gate even if they had passed the 6 earlier ones. With the council, some souls could produce the response that would receive the 7th mark and the position of the one who was not stopped. The council, in the priest's own view, was what made the theology, in practice, something other than a description of a fate that no ordinary soul could ever achieve. That is the tablet. That is what it says. 7 gates, 7 questioners. 7 questions. In an order the tablet says cannot be varied. The name given at the first breath. The debts that were not repaid. The blood that was carried, in both senses. The speech that was refused. The last transformative seeing. The self-knowledge that was not told. And the willingness to hear what one is, spoken by another, and to respond as oneself. 7 marks that can be received, in various weightings, and 7 conditions that can be assigned if the marks are not received. And, at the end of the 7, a single outcome, described in the tablet's final complete passages, called the position of the one who was not stopped, in which the soul, having been established as itself through the 7 questions, continues, as itself, in a form the tablet describes but does not, in its readable portion, complete. What can be said, now, about the tablet as a whole is limited by what the surviving material contains. The tablet is one object. It was found in one house. It was translated by one man, and his translation, though it has been reviewed by others in the century since, has not been superseded by any more complete reading, because no more complete tablet has emerged from any other Kutha excavation, or from any of the other sites where the Mesopotamian theology might have been practiced. What we have is what we have, and what we have is a description of a specific theology of the afterlife, held by the priests of a specific Mesopotamian sanctuary, written down at a specific historical moment, preserved in a burned house, translated in 1920, and held, since then, in a room in the British Museum that requires a supervisor's key. The theology, as it is described, has several features that distinguish it from the other theologies of the ancient Mesopotamian world. It is a theology that treats the moment of death as a moment of examination, and it treats the examination as consisting of specific questions in a specific order, with specific consequences. It is a theology that treats the soul as, in principle, capable of preparing for the examination, and it treats the priesthood as, in practice, the body responsible for the preparation. It is a theology that treats the outcome of the examination as, in most cases, an assignment to one of a set of conditions, and it treats one specific outcome as an exception, in which the soul, having passed all 7, continues in a form the theology names and, at least partially, describes. And it is a theology that treats the priesthood as, in some ongoing way, in contact with the souls that have reached the exceptional outcome, through mechanisms the tablet mentions but does not fully explain. These features, taken together, produce a theology that is unusual among the ancient Mesopotamian theologies that have come down to us. The most similar theologies, the scholars have noted, are not the theologies of the surrounding Mesopotamian cities. They are the theologies, later, of some of the mystery religions of the ancient Mediterranean, in which the initiate, having passed through the ordeals, achieves a specific status that the ordinary member of the community does not achieve. And they are, in some respects, the theologies of some of the surviving religious traditions of the modern world, in which the individual soul, having undertaken specific work during life, arrives at the moment of death in a condition that allows for an outcome the ordinary soul does not receive. Whether the Kutha theology influenced any of these later theologies, or was influenced by any earlier ones, or emerged independently in the specific context of the Mesopotamian priesthood, is a question that the tablet does not answer, and that the scholars, in their private notes, did not, on the available evidence, try to resolve. The tablet is one object. The theology it describes is described in that object, and the connections, if any, to other theologies, in other places or in other times, are connections that can be argued but that cannot, on the evidence of this tablet alone, be established. What the tablet does establish, and what has been the subject of the most careful scholarly attention over the centuries since the translation, is that the theology existed. It was written down. It was taught. It was practiced. And it produced, in the ancient Mesopotamian world, a specific set of counseling techniques and a specific set of preparation practices that the priests of Cutha considered central to their vocation. Whatever the theology described was, in metaphysical terms, real or not real, the theology itself was real in the sense that it was believed and taught and used, and the priests, in the tablet's own testimony, understood their work as the specific labor of preparing the dying for a specific examination that would follow the death. The question of what to make of the tablet, in the modern world, is a question that the scholars in their private notes return to repeatedly, without resolving. The tablet is, on one reading, a piece of ancient religious literature, of interest to scholars of the ancient world, but of no direct application to modern life. On another reading, the tablet describes an examination that the tablet claims is still being administered to every soul that dies, in exactly the same form and with exactly the same consequences as when the tablet was written. Whether either reading is correct is not, on the evidence of the tablet alone, a question that can be answered. The tablet says what it says. The reader can take it as the reader will. The material we have covered in this documentary is what the tablet says. Not more than that. The tablet, in its own text, is direct that the 7 questions are being asked in the order it lists of every soul that dies, and that the consequences of the answers are what the tablet describes. The tablet is direct that the ordinary human life produces a soul that receives, at most of the gates, one of the ordinary marks, and that arrives, at the end of the sequence, at one of the ordinary conditions. The tablet is direct that a small number of souls, through specific work undertaken during life, can produce answers that receive the heavier marks, and can, at the 7th gate, produce a response that receives the mark of the whole soul and the mark of the answering self, and can, thereafter, reach the position of the one who was not stopped. And the tablet is direct that the priesthood of Cutha was, in its own understanding, the body of teachers whose work was to make this possible for the small number of souls in each generation that were prepared to undertake it. Whether the theology is true, in the sense that would matter to any of us listening now, is not something the tablet can establish and not something this documentary has tried to argue. The theology exists as a description. It is preserved on the tablet, it has been translated, and the translation has been held. It has been read by a small number of scholars, and those scholars have left, in their private notes, the observation that the 7 questions are still being asked, in the phrasing each of them used in slightly different words. What the observation means is a question each reader will have to answer for themselves. The tablet, in its final broken lines, before the cracks make the reading impossible, appears to say something about the specific priests who wrote it down, and about the moment at which they made the decision to write down what had, until then, been transmitted orally. The fragments, in the assistant curator's transcription, include what appears to be a name, or perhaps a title, and a phrase that has been translated as, "in this hand, at this time," so that the 7 may be known. The phrase, the scholars agreed, is the closing formula of the tablet. It is the priests, in their own voice, explaining why they had committed the material to writing, so that the 7 may be known, not so that the theology would spread, not so that the priesthood's authority would be established, so that the 7 questions, and the 7 questioners, and the 7 answers, and the 7 consequences would be known in a form that could be read by anyone who could read the language at any time thereafter. The priests, in this closing, were direct. They were writing for a future they could not see. They were writing in the knowledge that the priesthood might not survive to transmit the material orally to the next generation. They were writing so that the material would exist in a form the future could find if the future had reason to look for it. And what the future, in the assistant curator in 1920 and in the scholars who came after him, has found, is what the priests wrote: the 7 questions, the 7 questioners, the 7 answers, the 7 consequences, and the position, at the end, of the one who was not stopped. The tablet, in its final phrase before the break, uses a word that has been translated in each of the surviving translations. In the same way, the word is the word for reader. The last legible words on the tablet, in the surviving text, are addressed to a reader. The priests, at the closing, were not addressing their own students. They were not addressing the family of the dying. They were addressing whoever, at some point in the unknown future, would come to read what they had written. And to that reader, in the tablet's final legible phrase, the priest said, in the assistant curator's rendering, this: "What you have read is what you will be asked." The tablet then breaks. The lines that would have followed, if any followed, are gone. The reader is left in the tablet's own final phrase, with the direct address, and with the specific claim that what the reader has just read is what the reader will, at some point, be asked. The priests, in that closing, were not describing a theology as a curiosity. They were not preserving it as a matter of academic interest. They were, in their own understanding, telling the future what the future would encounter. And the tablet, in the museum, in the room that requires the supervisor's key, is the record of what they told. What can be said, in closing this section, about the significance of that final address is limited to what the tablet itself offers. The priests wrote the closing in the form of a direct statement to a reader they did not know and could not identify. The reader, in the priest's framing, is any reader, at any time, who has come to the text and has read it through to the end. The claim that what has been read is what will be asked is not qualified in the tablet by any conditions about who the reader is, or where the reader is, or when the reader is reading. The claim is offered, in the closing, as a general claim about the relationship between the reading of the text and the eventual encounter at the moment of death, with the sequence the text describes. The scholars in the 20th century, in their notes on the closing, treated the address with more caution than they treated the descriptions of the individual gates. The descriptions of the gates could be evaluated as descriptions. They could be compared to other Mesopotamian materials. They could be assessed for internal consistency, for coherence with the surrounding theology, for plausibility in the specific context of the Meslam priesthood. The closing address is not a description. It is a statement made by the writers of the tablet to whoever, in whatever future, is reading their text. And the scholars, in evaluating the closing, were faced with a document that was, in its final legible phrase, addressing them directly, and telling them something specific about what they, as readers, would eventually encounter. Most of the scholars, in their notes, treated the closing as a rhetorical device. They read it as the priest's way of impressing on the reader the seriousness of the material, without necessarily claiming that the material would literally be encountered by every reader at the moment of death. Some of the scholars, in the more private of their notes, were less certain. One scholar wrote, in a note that survives in a letter to a colleague, that the closing had a specific quality that the earlier sections of the tablet did not have. The earlier sections read, he wrote, as a description of a theology. The closing reads, he wrote, as a communication. The distinction, he acknowledged, might be nothing more than a matter of literary register. Or it might be, he wrote, something else, and he did not think, on the evidence available, that he was in a position to say which. What we can say, standing where we stand, is that the tablet exists, and that its final phrase, whatever weight one gives it, is what the tablet, in the priest's own writing, ends with. The reader, in the priest's framing, has been addressed. The reader has been told what the reader will be asked, and the reader is free to make of the address what the reader will. That is the position the priests, in the closing, established. And it is the position the tablet, in the museum, in the room that requires the supervisor's key, continues to hold. There is one more small observation to make before the outro. It is an observation about the material itself, and about the position in which the material now stands. The tablet was found in 1878, in a burned house at Kutha. It was catalogued, and then it sat, unread, for 41 years, until the assistant curator in 1920 took it up and worked through the translation over the course of what appears to have been most of a year of steady labor. The translation was completed, the instruction was placed on the file, the material was set aside, and, in the centuries since, the tablet has been read by a small number of scholars whose notes are, in some cases, filed with the material, and in other cases held privately, and in a few cases lost. What we have covered in this documentary is drawn from those readings, and from the translation itself, and from the internal evidence of the tablet as the tablet has been described in the surviving records. The material is what it is. The claims it makes are the claims it makes. The reader, at the closing, is addressed by the priests who wrote the tablet, and is told what those priests, in their own understanding of the theology they served, believed the reader would eventually encounter. Whether the belief is correct, in any sense that a modern reader would recognize, is not for this documentary to argue. What this documentary has done, at length, and with attention to the specific material, is to present what the tablet says. That was the material's own request, in its closing address, made in the priest's own writing, at the point where the tablet's last legible line resolves the whole document into a single instruction, so that the seven may be known. That is what the priests wrote for. That is what the tablet, in its readable portion, contains. And that is what has now, in this material, been laid out from beginning to end. If you have listened this far, one thing is worth naming plainly. The tablet from Cutha is not the only surviving record of a system that treats history as running through fixed stages, each with its own examination, each with its own consequences. There is a second document, of a very different kind and from a different tradition, that lays out what it calls the 7 resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the 7 gates and the questions asked at each, and the checklist of signs for the 8th, 4 are already active. You will find the link in the description below. What you do with it, or whether you look at it at all, is your own to decide. The pattern the second document traces is a pattern of correspondence, not of prediction. It does not claim to know the future. It claims only that the past, when it is set beside the 7 gates in the order the tablet gives them, produces a set of matches that are, in the document's own careful phrasing, closer than chance would produce, and that the 5th match, if the pattern is what the document proposes it is a match whose signs would, by the document's own criteria, be already beginning to appear in the ordinary events of the present. Whether the criteria are met is a question the document sets out for the reader to answer on the evidence available to the reader at the time of the reading. That is all the document does. It sets out the pattern, it lists the criteria, and it leaves the assessment to whoever reads it. The tablet, at its closing, addressed a reader it could not name. It said to that reader, in the priest's own writing, that what had been read was what would, at the appointed moment, be asked. So does the second document, in its own way, address a reader it cannot name and offer to that reader a specific set of observations about the specific historical moment in which the reading is taking place. The 2 documents are not the same document. They are not from the same tradition. They do not claim, either of them, to be a commentary on the other. What they share, on the reading that the second document invites, is the framework of the 7s, and the position, in that framework, of a reader who is being asked to take the framework seriously enough to look at it and to decide what to make of it. What has been said in this material is what the tablet says, from the finding of the burned house at Cutha, through the assistant curator's translation, through the 7 gates and their questioners and their questions and their marks and their conditions, to the closing address in which the priests, in their own writing, told the reader what the reader would be asked. That is the tablet. That is what it says. That is the record the priests of Cutha, in the closing of their own writing, chose to leave behind for whoever, at whatever distance in the future, would come to it and read it through. And that, in full, is where this material now ends.